There have been plenty of bad storylines throughout wrestling history. You only have to look towards the likes of Retribution or the anonymous Raw general manager if you want any evidence of this. But while those were terrible in their own right, they never truly reached the level the angles we're going to talk about today did. And the reason for that is that these ones are so weird, so beyond belief, that they made us all stand up and say, WTF? Yes, today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the most ridiculous and wacky storylines in wrestling history. And where better to start than with one of the most ridiculous of them all, and that's the time Goldberg refused to follow the script in WCW. That's right, we're of course starting with an entry from WCW in 2000. Fresh from the mind of Vince Russo entry here, the king of WTF storyline writers. It all started when, upon taking up the reins of World Championship Wrestling once more in 2000, and feeling like the company needed a boost of something new if they were going to regain their footing in the Monday Night Wars, Russo became enamored with the idea of making fans believe wrestling was real again. That said, this unfortunately meant insulting many members of the audience's intelligence with some of the most ridiculous angles known to man. After all, we all know what we're watching isn't real, but we're using our suspension of disbelief to get invested. So pointing out the predetermined nature of the show while it's on isn't necessarily the best way to present things. As far as WCW was concerned though, people didn't have suspension of disbelief when it came to wrestling. And so, that was why during a triple threat bout between Goldberg, Scott Steiner, and Kevin Nash at that August's New Blood Rising pay-per-view, the Georgia native refused to go up for a powerbomb towards the close of the match, with this causing the other two men in the ring to look confused, all while commentary talked about how unprofessional Bill was, and how Nash and Steiner were now going to have to improvise. Yes, what we were being told here was that Bill Goldberg had gone against the planned finish, and now Vince Russo was furious with him. And that's not all, because in the wake of such a ridiculous moment, rather than fire Goldberg, Russo booked him in a wrestling match at the following month's Fall Brawl against the Big Bad Booty Daddy, where this time there would be no script. So at this point, fans were supposed to accept that everything on the show was scripted, all except this one match. And just to make things on the show even more convoluted, while this whole storyline was playing itself out, the rookie Chuck Palumbo had just become the unofficial WCW World Champion after screwing Booker T, all before the decision was later reversed. Seriously, WCW in 2000 was just wild. That said, 1999 had its terrible moments as well, because it was then that in a truly baffling angle, Ric Flair was admitted into a mental hospital. No, you didn't hear us wrong. In another Vince Russo classic, it was while feuding with Roddy Piper over the role of the president of WCW that the Nature Boy started to act a little irrationally even for him. Basically, he was firing people for no reason, stripping down to his underwear during interviews, and proclaiming himself to be the president of the United States. So realizing this was his opportunity to get rid of his rival then, Piper convinced Flair's son David to have him admitted into a psychiatric institution. And it was here things went buck wild, as on the following week's episode of Nitro, we were all treated to a bunch of segments showing Slick Rick's time in this institution. What did these segments entail? Well, they showed us what appeared to be a bad community theater version of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, as Flair got to know his new friends via the medium of dance. That said, he did at least get to keep his classic Nature Boy robe for some reason, and he did get to continue booking WCW via phone calls he was making to referee Charles Robinson. So there was that, but it all got even more ridiculous when, for no reason whatsoever, Scott Hall showed up. Then, after that, Arn Anderson used his apparent political connections to get not only Flair out of the hospital, but also everyone else that was there out too. Who cared if they needed medical attention? They had a wrestling show to go to. Yes, this one is a prime example of why WCW needed to end. But it's not like WWF weren't doing things just as stupid during that era either, to be fair. Need we remind you about the time Mae Young gave birth to a hand in 2000? To be fair though, we probably don't have to remind you too much about this one, as it's so infamous at this point it's hard to forget. But for those who don't remember, it all began when in February of that year, apparent lovemaking addict Mark Henry began falling for 77-year-old Mae Young, and the two had a torrid love affair with one another. No prizes for guessing this was allegedly done to try and lure Henry into quitting then, as Vince McMahon no longer wanted to pay his contract. But the world's strongest man wouldn't give up. No, to his credit, he went all in on the whole thing and tried to make lemonade out of the lemons he was given, and sold the whole idea that he and Young were star-crossed lovers the best he could. Still, that didn't make it any less insane when, at one point, Mae announced she'd somehow fallen pregnant despite her advanced age. How were WWF going to get out of this one then? Would they try to make us believe she actually had another child? Would they go for the dreaded miscarriage angle? Neither, as it happened, because instead, on the February 28, 2000 episode of Raw, the septuagenarian gave birth to a hand. That's right, Mae Young gave birth to a mannequin's hand in one of the most unhinged moments ever seen on a wrestling show. What was the logic here? We're still not entirely sure, to be honest, though it has been speculated that it was supposed to be a reference to some kind of adult toy used back in the day. Either way, once it was over, the whole thing would be dropped, with this remaining the case all the way up until a new reference was finally made to it on Raw 1000, when we got to see what the hand looked like as a grown man. Yes, wrestling can be strange at times, and this was also the case for another notable Attitude Era angle between a former headbanger and his kayfabe mother, which came out a couple of years later. What are we talking about this time? Why, the saga of Beaver Cleavage, of course. Yes, in true time-honored Vince McMahon tradition, it's time for more incest angles. And this one was especially insane as it saw headbanger Mosh abruptly drop his gimmick after his partner was injured and instead be repackaged as Beaver Cleavage, a clear reference to the lead character in the old 50s sitcom Leave It to Beaver. Of course, right there along for the ride with him as he portrayed this new gimmick was his kayfabe mother, Mrs. Cleavage, someone who could politely be described as buxom and fully living up to her name. But it wasn't other men on the roster she was hoping to attract with her cleavage. No, it was her son. As in a true WTF moment, it was soon revealed that they were in some kind of romantic relationship with one another. Obviously then, this was too much for even most Attitude Era fans to stomach, and it was clear the idea of drinking his mother's milk was too much for the former Mosh as well, because mere weeks after the whole thing began, in a worked shoot promo on an episode of Raw in 1998, Beaver Cleavage broke character during an interview and told fans he could no longer portray this gimmick. And that would be the end of that then, as the entire thing was scrapped in record time, with everyone being left to wonder what the point of any of it had been at all. Still, at least Mosh went on to something better, right? Well, not exactly, because his next gimmick, Chaz, was arguably worse, with it being implied he had beaten up the woman who had once portrayed his mother, who was now playing the role of his on-screen girlfriend. One angle that didn't come from the Attitude Era, though, is one which came almost a decade prior in the early 90s. And that's the time Papa Shango showed us all why he was WWF's resident voodoo priest when he put a curse on the Ultimate Warrior. Now, if you were a kid at the time watching this one, then you might remember it as being pretty good, or at least scary, as it was supposed to be. Why was this? Well, because in the most cartoonish era of the WWF, this was closer to a scene from a horror movie than something you'd find in a Saturday morning cartoon. Basically, it involved Shango deciding that following the Warrior's return to the company at WrestleMania 8 in April of 1992, he wanted to steal the babyface's soul, and his way of doing such a thing was to place a curse on him. So that's how we got the events of the May 16th episode of Superstars, where during a match against Brian Knobbs, Jim Hellwig began experiencing severe stomach pains, which caused him to later be taken to the back to be checked out by a doctor. And while there, he'd begin vomiting a green liquid which suggested something bad was going on inside him. But that wasn't the end of his misery, because 1 week later, while doing a promo segment, he'd begin bleeding a black fluid from the top of his head, with the explanation given for this being that it was a side effect of Papa Shango's curse. So obviously then, the Warrior had to put a stop to all this by beating his rival in the ring, right? Well, yes and no, because while he would get to pin the heel a few times over the months which followed on the house show circuit, the whole thing never really got a chance to get a proper blow-off, as by November, Hellwig would have been fired once more. And because of that, the only thing people really remember about it today are the bizarre scenes of the former WWF champion looking confused as black goo drips into his eyes like he's in an episode of The X-Files. Still, at least this was as WTF as it got during the golden era, right? Well, no, because we'd be remiss if we didn't mention another wacky angle from the year prior, one which saw Earthquake quite literally smash and end Damien the Snake. Of course, Damien the Snake was the beloved pet of Jake Roberts, and the reason he'd been squashed was so that John Tenta could best try and get in the head of his opponent prior to their inevitable clash in the ring. That's right, back in 1991, the best way of getting heel heat if you worked for WWF was to harm an animal. Hell, if you were the big boss man, it was the best method in 1999 as well. But we won't get into that here. No, what we'll get into instead is the aftermath of Earthquake choosing to sit on the sack holding Damien with all his might on an April episode of Superstars and presumably crush the poor thing. And that's because this aftermath involved Tenta, one of the most lovable men in wrestling history, go full pantomime villain when he appeared on a subsequent episode of Primetime Wrestling with a plate full of Quake burgers made out of what we were led to believe was the remains of Damien. Truly then, for the scene of Vince McMahon chowing down on one of these burgers alone, it deserves to be counted among the most WTF angles in wrestling history. And it's made all the better by the fact that the boss refers to Tenta as Mr. Quake throughout the segment. Hell, it even has a great punchline, as when Vince figures out what he's eating and tries to reprimand the big man, Earthquake simply replies by saying, "I gotta eat." That said, for as much of a joke as he was treating the whole situation, one person who wasn't amused was Jake Roberts himself, and so that's why he'd spend the rest of the summer seeking revenge against his rival by taking him on one-on-one all across the house show circuit. But in the end, it appears the grief got too much for him, as by the time the autumn had come around, he'd have turned heel and joined forces with The Undertaker, with us being left to assume that all this began once his beloved Damien was permanently ended. Yes, we suppose it's a justification for a heel turn, but what if your WTF storyline doesn't manage to justify a wrestler being presented as a villain so well? Well, that's exactly what happened in 2005 with our next subject, Muhammad Hassan. Okay, deep breath everyone, because this one is a prickly subject, as it all begins with the New York hijackings. That's right, following the biggest ever attack ever committed on American soil, there was a lot of tension running around the country, and this led to a lot of negative stereotypes. Obviously then, this is the kind of topic that requires a sensitive hand, especially when it's used for a storyline. So why Vince McMahon of all people thought he was the person to do this truly blows our minds. But he was convinced he could use it for an angle, and so that's what led to Muhammad Hassan gracing our screens in the middle of the 2000s, with his character being that of an Arab American who initially sought to prove his people didn't deserve the mistreatment they were receiving. As time went on, however, what should have been a layered character morphed into little more than a generic heel, something which kind of defeated the purpose of the whole thing in the first place. Still, even if Hassan was now being presented as the dastardly villain, no one could have guessed just how much the angle would backfire. When on the July 7th, 2005 episode of SmackDown, Hassan brought a group of masked men down to the ring to carry away The Undertaker. Sure, this was tasteless at the best of times, but what made it all the worse was the fact it aired on the same day as the attacks in London, England. So now, getting massive backlash, WWE was forced to abruptly drop not only the angle, but the character of Muhammad Hassan as well, as by this point, through no fault of his own, the man behind it, Mark Kopani, had become too hot to handle. Yes, in the end, WWE faced minimal punishment for this one, and the real victim was a promising wrestler who had his career cut out right from under him before he ever got a chance to truly get established. And although our next storyline wasn't as serious in its nature, it still made us all say WTF. That's right, ripped straight out of the pages of a bad adult film script, it's time to talk about the Torrie Wilson, Al Wilson, and Dawn Marie love triangle. What was the story here? Well, back in 2003, Torrie Wilson and Dawn Marie were two of the top stars of the WWE Women's Division, and things got racy when Torrie's real-life father Al began appearing on screen and was almost immediately seduced by Dawn. That's right, this was the angle which saw the former ECW star try to get one up on her rival by stealing her dad away and having a love affair with him, with this all getting so intense that before long, Al would actually propose marriage to his new lover. And what's more, his new lover would accept. Obviously then, such a move was a step too far for Torrie, so at that point, she tried to halt the proceedings. And in doing so, she found out the truth behind the whole scam. And this was that Dawn Marie actually wanted her instead, and that if she agreed to spend the night with her, she'd call off the wedding. And this all led to Dawn Marie and Torrie Wilson having a scene in a hotel room together in one of the most R-rated moments in WWE history. And following this, Dawn went ahead with the wedding anyway. Then, once the honeymoon came, they'd go a step harder with their romancing, so hard that Al actually expired due to overstimulation. Yes, you heard us right, this utterly insane angle ended with 62-year-old Al Wilson passing while consummating his marriage to a woman who was the mortal enemy of his daughter. Seriously, are we watching wrestling here, or are we watching Days of Our Lives? It's hard to tell. And that wasn't the only ludicrous angle of the Ruthless Aggression angle, as a couple of years later in 2005, an absolute all-timer would take place when Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero battled over the custody of a child in a ladder match. Honestly, it's hard to find the words for how legendarily maniacal this one is. So let's just start from the start, as it was in the summer of 2005 that Eddie Guerrero decided to drop a bombshell on fans, and that bombshell was that he was the real father of Rey's son Dominic, you know, the one who's currently a member of the Judgment Day. How could such a thing be possible? Well, because in storyline, Rey and his wife were having difficulty conceiving, so being the good friend that he was, Eddie had offered to step in and act as a surrogate on his behalf. But now, 7 years later, he was a heel and so had decided he wanted to take his biological child back, as he felt he should have parental rights to him. Obviously then, this had to be settled in a courtroom where a judge could assess the situation and come to a fair and balanced decision regarding it. What's that you say? This didn't happen, and instead the custody papers of Dirty Dom were literally held above the ring for the winner of a ladder match to collect? Did we tell you how much we love wrestling already? Yes, at that August SummerSlam, the first and to date only ever custody of Dominic ladder match took place and saw Rey heroically come out the winner, with this allowing him to get his boy back and end the angle on a happy note. Obviously though, in the years since, their kayfabe relationship has fallen apart as Dom has become a wrestler himself and has become one of the best natural heels in the business. But Dominic Mysterio isn't the only member of a legendary wrestling family to have taken part of a WTF storyline, because our next subject, Bray Wyatt, has also had his fair share too. And there are no better examples of this than the time WWE's booking team did a number on his Fiend character in the most insane way possible when they had him be burnt to a crisp live on pay-per-view. Yes, this one could have only come out of the Thunderdome era, as it required some camera trickery and no audience in attendance in order to make it work. Basically, the idea was at the end of Wyatt's Firefly Inferno match against the Viper at December 2020's TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs show, the heel would lose the bout and in the process be literally burnt alive. Now obviously it wasn't the actual Fiend who was burnt here. No, it was a well-made wax model which had been swapped in following a camera cut. But that doesn't make it any less wild to see a WWE show close out with the scene of a man being set on fire and left to burn. Seriously, in kayfabe, this might be the craziest of all the storylines we've looked at today, as we were witnessing Orton permanently end his opponent on camera. Or at least we thought it was his permanent end, because in true spooky fashion, The Fiend returned at Fastlane in March of 2021, now looking like a combination of a hot dog that had spent too much time in the microwave and a melting candle. What else can you say about this one? It's all there in the image of a scorched Bray Wyatt standing in the ring as his herald Alexa Bliss mounts Randy Orton and pins him. And following this, Bray would go on to play the character of Burnt Fiend for a while, and even appeared in an episode of Alexa's Playground on Monday Night Raw in one of the most surreal moments in wrestling history. Seriously, at this point, things were so strange, we can't help but to appreciate the creativity of the whole thing, even if it was downright crazy. Truly WTF wrestling storytelling at its finest. It goes without saying there have been many great wrestlers over the years. After all, everyone has their favorites, but sometimes those favorites have a mountain to climb when it comes to getting over with even the most ardent fans. And that can be because they've been given a terrible gimmick to work with. Yes, even the best of them sometimes must make the best out of what they're handed from time to time. But what are the best examples of great wrestlers given bad gimmicks in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the man of the hour, Cody Rhodes, and the period he played the character of Stardust. Now, we all know and love Cody Rhodes, as he's now one of the biggest stars in all of wrestling. But things weren't always so bright for the American Nightmare. No, back in the mid-2010s, his career was on a much worse trajectory, and that was largely because of the bad gimmick he'd been saddled with. What was this gimmick? Well, as we mentioned a moment ago, it was Stardust, a bizarre and flamboyant cartoon character who served as the sidekick to his older brother's Goldust. Understandably then, this mid-card comedy gimmick did Cody little favors, as even if he threw himself into it feet first, it was impossible for anyone to get too invested in something so goofy. No, even many fans of the New Generation era took one look at Stardust and thought it was a bit much, and that was why, come 2016, after having played the character for a full 2 years and gotten nowhere in the process, Cody would decide to leave WWE altogether and bet on himself out on the indie circuit. Of course, we all know how well that went for him now, but back at the time, it was a major risk to leave such a comfortable job behind in WWE. That said, when he was being asked to play something as bad as Stardust, we can understand why it would be creatively frustrating. And we can also understand why, since returning to WWE in 2022, the youngest Rhodes' son has seemingly had little to no interest in ever bringing the gimmick back up again on TV. But Cody isn't the only member of the illustrious Rhodes family who had to put up with a terrible gimmick during his first run in WWE. No, back during the late 80s and early 90s at the tail end of the Golden Era, his father Dusty would have to do the same thing when he memorably donned the polka dots. Many remember this one, we're sure, as it was so ludicrous it can't help but become ingrained in your mind once you see it for the first time. Take Dusty Rhodes, one of the biggest superstars of the Territory era. Hell, one of the biggest superstars in wrestling history, and bring him into WWF with such a wacky gimmick. Sure, the idea of Dusty being the common man was nothing new, as for years prior to that, he'd prided himself on being the living embodiment of the American dream, the son of a plumber who'd pulled himself up out of the dirt to become an NWA World's Champion, but never before had that American dream required him to wear the polka dots and act like a much more cartoonish version of himself. So what was the reason for Dusty being given the polka dot gear when he joined WWF in 1989? Well, Dusty had for a long time been the top face of Jim Crockett Promotions, one of the top competitors to the WWF. So when he finally made his debut in Vince McMahon's company, he was booked as more of a mid-card act, making it clear he was going to be booked as secondary on the pecking order to top stars like Hulk Hogan. But even if it wasn't ideal for Dusty, what the boss never fully counted on was the fact that Dusty was so good, so filled with charisma, he'd actually be able to get the polka dot clad dancing gimmick over with fans in feuds against the likes of Macho Man Randy Savage and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. That's right, some people are so great even a questionable gimmick can't keep them down for long. And of course it also helped that Dusty had that amazing WWF theme song. Who couldn't help but dance along to that whenever it started playing? But not every former star of the Southern Territories got the luxury of having a great theme song to help them offset their gimmick when they joined WWE. No, when it comes to our next subject, Barry Windham, his time in the WWF would only be remembered for the awful character of the Stalker, failing to get over it all. To be fair to Barry though, it would have been nigh on impossible for anyone to get the Stalker over. Even Ric Flair would have struggled with this. And the Sweetwater native should have never been put in this spot in the first place, as back during the 80s he was one of the top stars of the North American wrestling scene, with his run in Jim Crockett Promotions during the latter half of the decade going so well that he'd actually become both a member of the Four Horsemen and a former NWA World's Champion. Hell, even during the mid-80s, he'd been able to have a brief run in the WWF as one half of the US Express alongside Mike Rotunda, so it wasn't like Vince McMahon didn't know he was good. That said, when he returned to WWF in 1996, anything he'd done well in the past would be thrown out the window, as this was the point he was tasked with playing the Stalker. Who was the Stalker? Well, he was a man who roamed around the woods in camouflage makeup, stalking people. No, you didn't hear us wrong. This was the character former NWA World's Champion Barry Windham was asked to play when he arrived in WWF in 1996. Why was he stalking people? That wasn't clear exactly. All we knew about his motives came from his catchphrase, "Don't ever believe your eyes, because what you see may not be exactly what you think you see." Yes, if there were ever a gimmick that was dead on arrival, then this was it. So that was why, during his initial feud with Goldust, fans would sleepwalk through the proceedings, with this only serving to speed up the demise of the character altogether. Yes, it was in early 1997 that the Stalker gimmick would be mercifully dropped, as Barry Windham instead reverted back to being his old self, a hard-drinking, ass-kicking Texan. And this led to him teaming up with Justin Hawk Bradshaw to become one half of the new Blackjacks. Sure, this one didn't exactly see him find much success either, but it was better than playing a man who hung around in the woods. And believe it or not, this wouldn't be the only time WWE gave a former world champion a Stalker gimmick once they debuted with the promotion, because years later in 2001, the exact same thing would happen with Diamond Dallas Page. What a shame this one was. After all, back during the late 90s, Diamond Dallas Page was easily one of the biggest stars in all of wrestling. So great was he, in fact, he'd managed to do what almost no one else had been able to do, and that was break through the main event glass ceiling in WCW to become a true top guy, right there alongside the likes of Hulk Hogan, Sting, and Ric Flair. So you'd think that when WCW went out of business in 2001 then, and DDP decided to make the jump to WWF instead, Vince McMahon would be overjoyed to have such a talent added to his arsenal, right? Well, not quite. So it was then that rather than debuting Dallas in WWF during the invasion as the People's Champion of the South, someone who could maybe even get into a feud with The Rock over who was the real holder of that moniker, DDP was instead revealed as the man who'd been stalking The Undertaker's wife, Sarah. Why had DDP been stalking Sarah? Especially when it was already clear that he had a wife of his own in Kimberly Page? Well, that was because he wanted to get in the dead man's head and force him to make him famous by fighting him one-on-one in the ring. For sure, you can see the flaw in this plan then, that flaw being Diamond Dallas Page was already famous to many fans in 2001. But then, in the mind of Vince McMahon, WCW didn't count. And so because of that, he only saw DDP as a guy who'd gotten over in the minor leagues, but who hadn't proved himself anywhere else yet. And because McMahon didn't see DDP as a star then, it meant all the potential in pushing him hard in the WWF was wasted, as instead, after being revealed as the Stalker, Page got buried by The Undertaker in record time. But what of one of the other guys who managed to break through that glass ceiling in WCW? The one not named Bill Goldberg. Did he ever have a terrible gimmick of his own to work with? Why, yes he did. And that gimmick is our next entry, in fact. Yes, it's time to talk about the sad case of Booker T and his run as G.I. Bro. Now, we all know how great Booker T is. It doesn't matter if it's his run as tag team partner to Goldust, his run as King Booker, or his time spent in TNA as a member of the Main Event Mafia who occasionally moonlighted as Black Snow. Hell, it doesn't even matter if we're talking about his early run in WCW as one half of Harlem Heat alongside his brother Stevie Ray, that or his later period spent in the Main Event becoming the 5-time WCW champion. Booker T was always awesome. Except there was one period where he wasn't so awesome. Not that this was any fault of his, though. No, it was more the gimmick he'd been given to work with that was to blame. What was that gimmick? Well, it was G.I. Bro. Yes, back during WCW 2000, there was a period where, after splitting with Stevie Ray, Booker decided to join another stable, that of the Misfits in Action, a group who were all brought together by their shared military theme. And this group were given names that were bad puns, with these names including Private Stash, Major Guns, and General Hugh G. Rection. And then of course there was Booker's gimmick, G.I. Bro. Of course, years prior to this, Booker had already played this gimmick for a brief period on the independent circuit too, with it never getting him over to anywhere near the level as he later would as Booker T. So it was then that by the time the summer of 2000 came around, he'd have dropped the whole G.I. Bro act for the second time and would have instead reverted back to being just plain old Booker T, with it being at this point he finally reached the top of the mountain and became WCW World Champion for the first of 5 times. But not everyone was lucky enough to overcome a bad gimmick and go on to win multiple world titles after the fact. No, some never managed to win a world title at all. And that was the case with our next subject, William Regal, after he became the real man's man. Yes, we all know that William Regal is in the class with the likes of Owen Hart, Roddy Piper, and Jake Roberts, all great wrestlers who never won a world title, but he's also in that unfortunate class of wrestlers who once had to deal with a bad gimmick. And for him, that gimmick came in 1998. This was when, after joining WWF during the heights of the Attitude Era, he'd find himself being given a whole new character. So what idea would WWF's booking team have in mind for Regal then? A man who grew up in the north of England working that old world of sports style and who had a reputation for being one of the best technical wrestlers on the planet? Well, that would be the real man's man, of course. A character who liked nothing more than to do manly things like chop wood, shave, and drink orange juice. Yeah, there may have been a charm to this gimmick. It's certainly funny in that so bad it's good kind of way. But this was certainly not the ideal character for William Regal to get over in a major way in 1998. No, what he needed was a shooter-style character like what Dan the Beast Severn or Ken Shamrock had, as this would have allowed him to shine by using the things he was best at. In the end, though, things didn't work out that way for the Englishman, and so instead he got given something more comedic in its nature. Still, at least William Regal isn't the only person who was having to deal with a bad repackaging during that first half of the Attitude Era. No, elsewhere on the show, a certain former Earthquake, a man who went by the government name of John Tenta, was having to do something similar with the character of Golga. Of course, you wouldn't have known it was John Tenta playing this character unless someone told you, though, because he was hidden so well behind a mask, there was no way of knowing the identity of the mysterious oddity at first glance. But then, maybe that's for the best, as we imagine many people don't want to associate Golga with Earthquake. After all, Earthquake was a top guy. And this was true from the point he debuted with the WWF in 1989 and throughout the Golden Era. Hell, here was a character that could be equally as great at being the big monster heel going up against Hulk Hogan as he was at being the lovable babyface who could serve as one half of a super heavyweight tag team alongside Typhoon. So it's easy to see why the gimmick is remembered so fondly today. Unfortunately, though, the same love would not be given to Golga when he debuted in 1998. Why was that? Well, Golga didn't really do much of anything outside of dance and show a fanboy-like love for Eric Cartman from South Park. But then none of the oddities really did much during their WWF runs, and that's true no matter which member of the stable we're talking about, be that Giant Silva, Kurrgan, or even the Insane Clown Posse. Of course, them doing so little was probably the point though, as they were always meant to be treated like a circus sideshow rather than a powerhouse wrestling act. And no one was more of a sideshow within this group than Golga, because rather than being the mega overstar he had been in WWF before, All John Tenta got to do with this character was portray a man who hid behind a mask. Really, the question should have been why not just have Earthquake return at this point and get some value out of the Canadian instead of having him locked away in this comedy undercard role. Well, the reasons for that, if you believe the rumor and innuendo, are twofold. For one, Tenta had apparently lost a lot of weight since the early 90s, and so it was felt he could no longer convincingly play the super heavyweight Earthquake. And on top of that, there was a belief by Vince McMahon that there simply wasn't enough nostalgia associated with the Earthquake character to merit bringing it back in 1998. So because of this, what we instead got was one of the strangest gimmicks of the era, and one of the few that couldn't get over during a time when everyone was getting over. But it could be worse. It could be the gimmick our next big man was saddled with when he returned from an absence from the WWE in 2012. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Prince Albert, and the time he became Lord Tensai. Yes, let's flash back to the Attitude Era again for a moment, as that was where Prince Albert first rose to prominence as a dependable mid-card act, whose most notable feature was that he had the hairiest back the wrestling world had seen since the days of George the Animal Steele. It didn't matter if we were talking about his original incarnation as a tag team partner to Droz, his later stable with Test and Trish Stratus, or his eventual transformation into A-Train, a member of X Factor. Matt Bloom always played his role well. So solid would he be in this role, in fact, after he left WWE in 2004, he'd find himself working over in Japan for a while, where he became a two-time IWGP Tag Team Champion. And this was what led to the idea of rebranding him as an ancient mystic Asian warrior named Lord Tensai when he returned to the Fed in 2012, with the idea here being to never reference that Bloom had ever been in WWE prior under a different guise. The only problem with this, though, was that even if he dressed differently and even if he now had tattoos painted on his face, this was very clearly still Prince Albert. There was simply no mistaking it. And so almost immediately then, fans started chanting for Albert during Tensai matches, with this forcing WWE to acknowledge the fact that yes, they were one and the same person. Needless to say then, from that point on, any menace which was supposed to be present in the character was gone, and it was difficult to take him seriously, even if he did get pinfall wins over both John Cena and CM Punk. No, the problem here was there was just no way of believing that an excursion over to Japan had suddenly turned A-Train into a master of the martial arts. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the gimmick of Lord Tensai would not be long for the world, despite WWE's initial plans for it. And so it was that by the time 2013 came around, the big man would be partnering up with Brodus Clay, where he took on the dreaded dancing gimmick, a gimmick which has meant the end for pretty much every performer who's ever been saddled with it throughout history. Still, at least Matt Bloom ended up having things work out for him in the long run, as after retiring from in-ring action in 2014, he'd find himself getting a nice job as head trainer with the WWE Performance Center, with this being a spot he continues to fill to this day. It's just a shame the same cushy behind-the-scenes job wouldn't be waiting for our next subject, Shane Douglas, after he played Dean Douglas in mid-90s WWF. Yes, we're going back to the era of wrestlers with jobs, that special time which gave us the likes of Duke the Dumpster Droese, The Goon, Dr. Isaac Yankem DDS, and of course, Dean Douglas, a villainous high school teacher. Why was Douglas a high school teacher? Well, because prior to finding fame as the franchise of Extreme Championship Wrestling, Shane Douglas had actually been a teacher himself for a while. So when he eventually decided to leave the Revolution back in Philly behind and take the big money deal from Vince McMahon, this was what awaited him once his new boss learned about his prior life. Now, you could argue it should have been nigh on impossible to take someone with the charisma of 1995 Shane Douglas and not have him succeed. After all, this was the man who had literally started what was going on over in Paul Heyman's company with one of the most incendiary promos ever cut. Unfortunately, though, instead of him being a version of his ECW character, he was given a totally different gimmick to try and get over instead. Would he be successful in this? No, because even if Dean Douglas had gotten over with some of the audience at the time, he still would have fallen victim to the backstage politicking of the Clique. That's right, if we know one thing about mid-90s WWF, it's that if you weren't on the good side of the group made up of Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Triple H, and Sean Waltman, then you weren't going to get very far. And Dean Douglas found this out quickly enough himself. Hell, this was why his run with the Intercontinental title lasted all of a few minutes, and it was also why, come 1996, he'd have left WWF and returned to his old stomping grounds of Philadelphia once more. Could Dean Douglas have been something more? Sure, there was something there, we suppose. At the very least, it was Shane Douglas, so if he'd been given more time and space, we imagine he could have at least made some part of the gimmick work for him. But circumstances would sadly never allow that, and so his time in WWF would instead be all too brief and remembered only for the fact that he had to work with that gimmick of a villainous school teacher, a true cartoon idea of a heel if we ever saw one. But then this was far from the most cartoonish gimmick Vince McMahon ever gave one of his performers. No, years later, during the early 2010s, he'd create an even wilder one when he introduced us all to farting Natalya. Yes, despite being one of the best women's wrestlers of her generation and one of the few beacons of hope for the division during the Divas, the boss never saw Natalya as someone who could carry a division with her technical in-ring prowess. Rather, he thought she needed this character to get over. Unfortunately for the Hart family member though, the character McMahon created for her wouldn't be something good like Bret or Owen got. No, instead she'd be sent right down into the realm of comedy gimmick when, during a series of backstage segments, she suddenly started passing gas at random intervals. And this wasn't just any old gas. No, clearly Natalya had some intestinal issues going on at the time, as these farts were so bad they could pretty much knock out anyone who just so happened to be walking past at the time. Yes, seemingly only one man thought this was entertaining, and that was Vince McMahon, and sadly he was also the man in charge at that time. So because of that, fans had to suffer through weeks of Natalya randomly farting during backstage segments, and even at one point in the ring, before the boss finally got bored of the whole thing and dropped it as abruptly as he did so many things back then. What would Natalya do after that? Well, she's gone back to being a great in-ring wrestler who helped to keep the division afloat during the down times, as well as the good times. Yes, thankfully this gimmick didn't have too much of a negative effect on her in the long term, as fans understood who was behind it and they loved her anyway. It's just a shame the same couldn't be said about everyone we've looked at today then, because while some were able to overcome their bad characters like Natalya did, others ended up falling into irrelevance because of it, with this showing just how damaging one bad gimmick can be for a performer. Wrestling is an industry built on the suspension of disbelief. Sure, the characters people play are often real to them, but that doesn't change the fact that this is all still a show. And that's even more so when these characters get fake versions to go along with them. But what are the biggest examples of imposter wrestlers? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the story of the fake Undertaker. Yes, it was in the summer of 1994, after Mark Calaway was seemingly killed off at that January's Royal Rumble following his loss to Yokozuna in a casket match, that a new version of the Dead Man started appearing on TV, with this one being managed by the character's original second, Ted DiBiase. Of course, for anyone paying attention though, it was clear this wasn't the original. No, it was nothing more than a cheap imposter. That said, none of this stopped the $1 Million Man from parading him around like he was the true Dead Man, with this eventually being enough to draw the ire of Paul Bearer, as it would be in the weeks leading up to SummerSlam that he'd return to TV and claim this fake was not long for the world. Why was this? Well, because the real Undertaker was set to return to take him on. Where would things go from there then? Well, the real Undertaker would indeed return at SummerSlam, as the two faced off against each other in what unfortunately turned out to be one of the worst stinkers WWF had ever given us at the time. Still though, even if the match itself sucked, the fake Undertaker, someone who would disappear from TV following this, has remained a nostalgic figure for young fans who were watching at the time, as it was one of the early attempts the WWF gave us of an imposter version of a popular gimmick. And for those who weren't aware, the person playing this imposter was none other than Brian Lee, future member of the Disciples of Apocalypse and real-life close friend of the Dead Man. But what about Mark Calaway's kayfabe brother Kane? Didn't he have an imposter version of him running around at one point too? Why, yes he did, with this being our next subject. Now this one isn't as fondly remembered, as it barely even got out of the starting gates. Yes, it would be in 2006, over a decade after the Phenom had dealt with his own doppelganger, that Kane would have to deal with the same problem. Of course, in his case, it wasn't Brian Lee coming out in a Wish.com version of his gear to confront him on the May 29th episode of Raw that year. Rather, it was future Bullet Club member Luke Gallows. Not that you would have known this if you were only watching on TV though, because we never even got to the point of a reveal before the whole angle was dropped abruptly, presumably for the reason that it just wasn't working. That's right, after that initial showdown between the pair led to the real Kane being freaked out, a one-on-one match would be booked for June 25th's Vengeance pay-per-view, with the idea at the time being that this would merely be round one of a lengthier program. The only problem with this plan, however, was that once the match managed to stink out the joint, it became clear fans were not loving this story. And so, because of that, the decision was made to scrap the whole thing with immediate effect. How would this play itself out on screen? Well, the real Kane would drag his imposter backstage after he beat him, pull his mask off, then throw him out of the building through an emergency exit, with the fake Kane never to be seen again following this. But what about our next subject, or subjects to be more precise? And as it happened, one of these was played by Glenn Jacobs. Yes, it's time for us to talk about the fake Diesel and Razor Ramon. Yes, back in early 1996, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had decided that, with their payoffs not being where they would have liked them to be, and with WCW offering them some serious money to jump ship, they were going to split from WWF and head down to Atlanta instead. Obviously, then this left Vince McMahon with a problem, as he was losing two of his biggest stars at the time. Luckily for him, though, he still owned the rights to their WWF characters, Diesel and Razor Ramon. So it was with this in mind then that he came up with the idea to not let these characters end, and instead simply recast them with the future Kane and journeyman performer Rick Bogner, respectively. How would this go down with fans? Well, it was not a rousing success. No, quickly seeing through the facade, fans immediately showed their disinterest towards the two when they were introduced on screen by Jim Ross in the summer of that year, for the simple reason that they were just no substitute for Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. Needless to say then, these imposters would quickly fall into obscurity as their TV time grew less and less by the week, with the last time either of them was seen being the 1997 Royal Rumble. But at least Glenn Jacobs would have gone on to bigger and better things by the time 1997 was over, as it was then that he'd debut as the Big Red Machine and start a run which would last for over 2 decades. But what of a one-time tag team partner of his? We're pretty sure he had a brief imposter version of him running around too, and that's why the short-lived fake Mankind is our next subject. Now, when we say this one was short-lived, we mean it, as it was only around for the purposes of one angle. Yes, back in late 1999 and early 2000, Triple H and Stephanie McMahon had effectively taken control of WWF TV after they got married in kayfabe and then ejected Vince McMahon. And trying to make the most of it, the McMahon-Helmsley regime, as they would go on to be known, would make life a living hell for the babyface roster. Obviously, then, one of their biggest targets here was Mick Foley, largely on account of him refusing to bend the knee to his new bosses. Hell, so much would the heels target Mankind here, they'd at one point even cost him his job when they booked him in a pink slip on a pole match, which he subsequently lost. And after that was done, the McMahon-Helmsley regime would further rub salt in the wound by bringing out a fake Mankind on TV who they could parade around to mock him. As to who played this fake Mankind, well, that would be Dennis Knight, someone better known to most fans as Mideon. Not that Knight would get to play this role for long, though. No, after only a couple of appearances, the real Mankind would manage to get reinstated, and this would lead to him challenging Triple H to a street fight at the 2000 Royal Rumble with the WWF title on the line. Well, we say it was Mankind who challenged Triple H at the Rumble here, but in truth, it was actually Cactus Jack that Foley metamorphosed into just in time for the fight, presumably because he knew he needed an extra violent persona if he wanted to win that one. And it's just as well he did, because the match which followed was arguably the best one of the entire Attitude Era. As for the fake Mankind, well, he'd disappear quickly following this, with Dennis Knight instead moving on to play the role of Naked Mideon before the year was out, all before eventually retiring from the ring altogether and going on to start a second career as a chef. Yes, it was a brief example of a fake version of a character showing up on WWF television, but one which contributed to a great angle and an even better match. But what about the imposter versions of characters who appeared in WCW? After all, there were plenty of them too. And that's exactly why it's time for us to move over to Atlanta for our next entry as we look at the peculiar case of the Renegade. That's right, the only man who could challenge Hulk Hogan's run of dominance as WWF's top babyface star was the Ultimate Warrior. Hell, this even led to the two having an iconic showdown with one another in the main event of WrestleMania 6. And, to the shock of many, in that match it would be the Warrior who won to take home both the WWF title and the Intercontinental title. As you can probably guess then, this was a loss that stuck in Hogan's craw for years thereafter, so when he joined WCW during the mid-90s and that company started bringing in a lot of those other Golden Era stars like Randy Savage and Brutus Beefcake to work with him, it felt like it was only going to be a matter of time until Jim Hellwig made his way there too, and we got the big rematch between the pair where Terry Bollea would get his win back. Needless to say then, when WCW began hyping up the debut of their Ultimate Surprise in early 1995, someone who looked suspiciously like the Ultimate Warrior when seen in silhouette, everyone figured they knew exactly where this was going. That was until they didn't. Yes, in one of wrestling's biggest bait and switches of all time, it wouldn't be the Ultimate Warrior who debuted uncensored on March 19th of that year. Instead, it would be the Renegade, a budget version of the gimmick if we ever saw one, and one which was played by Richard Wilson instead of Jim Hellwig. Needless to say, this did not go down well with fans. So it was that rather than becoming a player in WCW's main event scene and even getting to challenge Hulk Hogan at one point, the Renegade would quickly slip into the role of mid-card act as he feuded with the likes of Arn Anderson and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff over the television title. That's right, it was the flop to end all flops. And to make matters worse, by the time 1998 came around, the real Warrior would have joined World Championship Wrestling and would be entering into an all-time bad feud with the Hulkster. So this made the Renegade even less relevant than ever. But this isn't the only example of a fake version of a character appearing in WCW over the years. No, before that, we have the exact same thing happening with our next subject, Sting, and his notable doppelganger. How did this one come about? Well, to answer that question, we have to go all the way back to 1996, the time when the New World Order had arrived in Atlanta and were taking over the whole show. Back then, you'd be hard-pressed to find a babyface who could stand up to this heel group. Hell, many on the roster were actually choosing to join forces with the Invaders instead. And this meant everyone had suspicious eyes on them as people waited to see who would defect next. One person few could imagine defecting, however, was Sting, and that's why it was such a shock when, in September of that year, he appeared to turn on his on-screen best friend Lex Luger after coming out of an NWO limousine. Did this mean what we all thought it meant? That Steve Borden had gone to the dark side? That was certainly what the babyface side of the locker room believed. In the end, though, it would be revealed that this was not the case. No, instead, the NWO had hired a fake Sting to attack Luger on that night in order to make it look like the good guy had gone bad. And once the real Sting was able to show the world this, he decided this wasn't a fight he wanted a part of anymore. Why was this? Well, he couldn't deal with the fact his friends hadn't trusted him. So because of this, he'd spend the next year and a half removing himself from the proceedings as he sat up in the rafters, watching what was going on to his company from a distance. As to what happened to the fake Sting during this time, the one played by Jeff Farmer, well, he'd continue to work for the company, albeit now under the name of NWO Sting. And NWO Sting would, as it happened, have a decent amount of success in his own right. Sure, he'd never reach the heights of Steve Borden or anything, but he would carve out a nice run for himself as a mid-card heel, with him at one point even getting to venture over to Japan for a while to be a part of that company's branch of the New World Order. But let's move away from him for now and back over to WWE for a while, as it's there we find our next example of a fake version of a character, the case of the Bella Twins and their twin magic. Yes, we're not saying that either of the Bella Twins are a fake version of the other here exactly. No, both are very accomplished in their own rights. After all, in the case of Brie Bella, she's a former Divas champion and someone who has since gone on to become a mogul outside of the ring with her work in the fitness industry. And as for her twin sister Nikki, well, she's also found success in these outside endeavors, all while also being a two-time former Divas champion and someone who's just made an in-ring return at the 2025 Royal Rumble. Back in the summer of 2008, though, many fans didn't know there were two of them. No, back then, a lot of people would have only known Brie Bella, a fresh new rookie who had recently joined the company. But pretty soon it would become clear that there was more to her than met the eye, as pretty regularly during her matches, when she was at her most beaten down, she'd disappear under the ring, only to come back out again a few moments later seemingly fully revived and ready to get the win. So what was going on here? Well, as it would eventually be revealed, there were actually two Bella sisters. And whenever Brie was going under the ring, it was her identical twin sister Nikki who was emerging, fresh as a daisy and with a clear advantage over her opponent. Obviously then, this led to them scoring a lot of early victories by dastardly means. And when this deception was unveiled, the babyface roster of the women's division was not happy about it. But they wouldn't have to be upset for long, because now that the ruse had been rumbled, there would be no more examples of twin magic, at least not without WWE now being fully aware of what kind of tricks the sisters were trying to pull. No, now both Bellas would hit the ring together more often than not in tag team matches, and that would start a run for them which would last for several years and would see them eventually be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2020. So while you could argue their initial tactics were certainly underhanded, it did work out for them in the long run. It's just a shame those same tactics didn't work out quite as well for our next subject in the long run then, Doink and all the fake versions of him over the years. That's right, while the original and best version of Doink might have been played by Matt Bourne, he was far from the only person to wear the face paint over the years. No, at least a dozen people have done this across various different companies. And the first notable example of a fake Doink making an appearance happened at WrestleMania 9. What took place on this show? Well, during his match with Crush, Bourne would get one over on his opponent when, toward the end of the bout, an imposter version of him, played by Steve Keirn, would come out from under the ring, twin magic style, and help to lay out the babyface so that the heel could get the win. But while that moment was certainly memorable, it was far from the only time an imposter version of the clown would feature inside of a wrestling ring. No, once Matt Bourne was fired, numerous other people would pick up the mantle in the years following, with perhaps the most famous one being Ray Apollo, the man who became the second full-time Doink in 1993. Even outside of him, though, there were plenty of others, with some of the names who donned the face paint at that point including Steve Lombardi, Mark Starr, and Ace Darling. And that's not even getting into the Doink impersonators who have appeared in one-off cameo appearances following the character's initial removal from TV, either for the purposes of getting in their opponent's head or just to give a fun moment for the audience. Those names include people like Jeff Jarrett, Chris Jericho, and Nick Dinsmore. And if we want to get technical, the mini versions of Doink also count as fake versions of the character too, meaning not only is Dink applicable for this video, but also Pink and Wink as well. But all of this is to say that the nature of the Doink character being hidden behind clown makeup has made it very easy for imitators to take up the role over the years, and for fans to mostly buy into it whenever this happens, as it's not so obvious as having a fake Diesel or Razor Ramon running around. So in many ways, the WWF are lucky they had the character dressed the way he did in the first place, as it's given the whole thing more longevity than it ever would have otherwise. Sadly though, the same luck cannot be found in our next example of a doppelganger version of our character. No, in the case of Sin Cara and his fake equivalent, both of these would have a very hard time in WWE. Yes, in early 2011, Luis Alverde, better known in Mexico as Místico, would make his debut for WWE under the new gimmick of Sin Cara. Unfortunately though, Sin Cara's style was never able to really translate to WWE, and this led to him quickly struggling to get over with not only fans, but management too. So much would he struggle, in fact, when he was busted for a wellness policy violation soon thereafter in July of that same year, a new person would be brought in to play the Sin Cara gimmick, with this new person being Jose Rodriguez, someone who also confusingly went by the name of Místico at one point down in Mexico. And that would lead to a situation where, once the original was able to return to the ring again, there would be two versions of the same gimmick running around the halls of WWE. How would WWE deal with this situation? Well, in true wrestling fashion, it would have to be settled in the ring. That's right, at that October's Hell in a Cell, the pair would have a one-on-one blow-off bout with each other. The only problem with this, though, was that with Rodriguez also struggling to adapt to the WWE style, the match which followed wasn't much to write home about. And so it was that the tale of which one of these people was the real Sin Cara fizzled out, with one of them simply changing their name to Unico and moving on from the whole situation. That was, of course, until the original Sin Cara left WWE altogether a few years later, and Unico once again found himself working under the mask. Yes, it was a very confusing time, and one which was made all the more confusing by the fact that the two men were under masks for so much of it. But let's move away from that storyline and on to our next entry instead, the time that during late 2010 SmackDown, a fake Eric Rowan appeared on TV. What was the situation exactly? Well, it all took place in the summer of 2019. That was the point Rowan and his then tag team partner Daniel Bryan became involved in a storyline with Roman Reigns. You see, at this point, a mystery attacker had been targeting the big dog for a while, and after questioning the locker room to find out who might be responsible, Roman was informed by Buddy Murphy that the man in question was none other than the former Wyatt family member. Obviously then, when confronted about this, Rowan denied any such wrongdoing, and his tag partner Bryan was by his side here, with him at this point demanding he'd get to the bottom of the situation. What few could have imagined at this time, though, was that the American Dragon getting to the bottom of the situation would result in him unveiling the person he believed had carried out the attacks a couple of weeks later, with this being, well, a guy with a shaved head and a beard. Yes, it appeared here that this was someone who just so happened to look like Eric Rowan, and so the whole thing had been a case of mistaken identity. However, this would soon lead to yet another swerve, because not long after this, it would be revealed that Rowan had indeed been the attacker all along, and this led to him turning on Bryan. That's right, this was all effectively just a roundabout way to turn Daniel Bryan babyface again. But let's move away from WWE again for a moment because it's in TNA that we find our next entry. And this one is a little bit more lighthearted as it's a tale of a shark who became human, who became a rattlesnake. Who are we talking about here? Why, Shark Boy, of course. Sure, John Tenta may have taken up the shark gimmick first, but he wouldn't be the most memorable person to do such a thing in wrestling because it was in the late 90s that Dean Roll began portraying the comedy part of Shark Boy on the North American indie circuit, with the idea here being that he was a shark who had at some point decided to become a wrestler. Yes, we know wrestling is a weird place. As time went on, though, and Shark Boy became a member of the TNA roster, it became clear the Ohio native was going to have to tweak his gimmick if he wanted to have more longevity, and that's what led to him making the truly odd decision to turn it into a Steve Austin parody in 2008. No, you didn't hear us wrong, the comedy shark gimmick had now evolved to aping Stone Cold himself. How did this happen? Well, after falling into a coma after apparently taking one too many shots to the head, the babyface would wake up on the January 17th, 2008 episode of Impact, now believing that he was indeed the Texas Rattlesnake. Needless to say then, this led to him coming out to the ring in a leather vest, all well rather than drinking a beer, he would enjoy a nice cool clam juice instead. And when he wasn't doing that, he was letting us all know in his best Steve Austin impression that he was there to raise Shell. And that if fans were behind him on this, all they needed to do was give him a shell yeah. Yeah, it was a crazy gimmick, but a fun one nonetheless, and it served its purpose of freshening up the Shark Boy character and allowing him to enter into a tag team with the mysterious Curry Man, someone who, as legend goes, may have had some kind of affiliation with the fallen angel Christopher Daniels at some point. How would their tag team run go? Pretty well. Sure, they'd never win the gold or anything, but they'd always be an entertaining duo to watch. And the Shark Boy Stone Cold parody would continue to live on even after this was done, as fans clearly hadn't had enough of it yet. Really, the only negative we could say about Stone Cold Shark Boy is that it didn't stick around long enough for Steve Austin to return to the ring and have a match with him, because what a sight that would have been. And what a bizarre way it would have been for the Rattlesnake to come out of retirement after all those years. But we guess that's the strange appeal a fake version of a character can have in wrestling, as all the other examples we've looked at today have shown. The Attitude Era is remembered as one of the best, if not the greatest period in wrestling history for a reason. And that reason is because it had so many fantastic storylines. Yes, back at the turn of the millennium, people were tuning into Monday Night Raw in droves to find out what was going to happen next with their favorite angles and characters. But what were the best of these? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the biggest story of them all, Austin versus McMahon. That's right, to those who were watching WWF in the late 90s, this was the most engaging thing on television, as it told the exploits of Stone Cold Steve Austin, hard-drinking, trash-talking man of the people, and his continued battles with his evil billionaire boss, Vince McMahon. Hell, so popular was this one, it's pretty much responsible for the Attitude Era happening at all. But then, how could it not get people invested when it gave us such scenes as the Rattlesnake driving a Coors truck down to the ring to give Vince's corporation a beer bath, or him holding a mock gun to the boss's head and causing him to urinate on himself on a live episode of Raw? And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the iconic moments Austin vs. McMahon gave us. Seriously, if you were watching back then, you'll no doubt remember the whole show often revolved around this angle. Sure, its importance in the pecking order was helped by the fact it usually involved the WWF title, but you could have taken the title away, and it still would have been the thing people wanted to see the most, as at this point in WWE's history, there was simply no babyface more over than Steve Austin, and there was no heel more despised than Vince McMahon. And how about the fact that this story bookmarked the entire Attitude Era? Yes, while Austin did deliver his first stunner to the boss in the autumn of 1997, it's generally accepted that the story really got going the night after WrestleMania 14, a common start point for the era. And with it technically ending with Stone Cold turning heel by siding with McMahon at WrestleMania 17, the almost universally accepted endpoint for the Attitude Era, you can see how this ended up serving as the through line for the entire time period. That said, for as important as Austin vs. McMahon was to the success of WWF at the turn of the millennium, it wasn't the only great angle going on back then. No, there were plenty of others too, one of which also involved the boss, and that's the whole Ministry of Darkness saga. How did this one involve Vince? Well, back in 1999, after losing a Buried Alive match to Steve Austin and returning a month or so later with an all-new, darker incarnation, The Undertaker set about forming a cult-like ministry around himself. a Ministry of Darkness, if you will. And once he'd finalized his ranks here, with them including the likes of Farouk, Bradshaw, Viscera, Mideon, and for a while at least the Brood, he set about enacting a hostile takeover attempt of the entire WWF. That's right, it was at this point that the Deadman began targeting Vince McMahon specifically, with him going as far as to kidnap the boss's own daughter Stephanie at one point and attempt to sacrifice her at the altar of a black wedding. How would the McMahons respond to this? Well, while Vince would remain furious and while Stephanie would find a new lover in the form of Test, Shane would do the unthinkable because it was around here that he took the corporation stable he was by then in charge of and had them join forces with The Undertaker in the unholy corporate merger that was the Corporate Ministry. So you'd think at this point it was just a matter of time before the Phenom completely took over the WWF. But before that happened, we'd have to get the reveal of the mysterious higher power who had been instructing Taker from the shadows all this time, Emperor Palpatine style. And it was on the June 7th, 1999 episode of Raw that this reveal finally happened, as that was when fans found out the higher power had been Vince McMahon all along. Yes, this one notoriously made little sense and has since been mocked for that very reason by many fans, with the moment Vince McMahon uncovers himself being particularly noteworthy because of Jim Ross's excellent "Aw, son of a bitch" proclamation. That said, it still remains an iconic storyline nonetheless. Hell, the sheer strangeness of the reveal might even have made it more iconic than it would have been had the ending been different. And it's not like this was the only iconic storyline The Undertaker was involved in during the Attitude Era either, because both before and after the Ministry of Darkness, we had the ongoing tale of the Brothers of Destruction. Who were the Brothers of Destruction? Well, they were The Undertaker and his brother Kane, the latter of whom was someone who up until 1997 had been considered lost forever after dying in a fire as a child. But in true telenovela style, towards the end of that year he reappeared to cost the Phenom his first ever Hell in a Cell match, and at this point, with him blaming his older sibling for starting that fire, a feud for the ages broke out between the two. So personal would this one get, in fact, it carried on for years after, all throughout the Attitude Era in fact, with their first series of bouts ending with the Big Red Machine quite literally being set on fire again. And this then led to the second phase of the angle where the brothers finally put their differences aside and started teaming up. Of course, such a partnership was never destined to last forever though, and so it was that before 1998 was over, the Deadman would have turned heel on Kane after revealing that he indeed was the person who started that fire all those years ago. How would Kane respond to this? Well, by going off on a side quest for a while, which involved him partnering up with and eventually being betrayed by X-Pac. But once that was over, it was right back to his older brother, as before the Attitude Era was done, the two would mend fences again and reunite once more as a tag team, this time on the babyface side of the alignment chart. That's right, back at the turn of the millennium, you'd be hard-pressed to find a saga with so many twists and turns in it than you'd have found in the story of The Undertaker and Kane. And that's why it still stands tall today as one of the great angles of the Attitude Era. But what of another great tale of betrayal that was running concurrently to this? Well, that one is our next subject as it happens, the story of The Rock and Farouk. Yes, while it may not outright top many people's lists when it comes to great Attitude Era angles, this one is easily one of the best if you go back and look at it today. And part of the reason it was so great was because it gave us The Rock as we know him today, an uber cocky heel who knew he was better than everyone else and wasn't afraid to show it. So how did this one get started then? Well, back in 1997, after an initial run with WWF which was mired by fans rejecting him for being too cookie-cutter of babyface, Rocky Maivia decided to shake things up by turning heel and joining Farouk's Nation of Domination. Of course, over that time though, the man, now going by the name of The Rock, proved to be such a charismatic force of nature, it was impossible for fans not to enjoy seeing him more than they enjoyed seeing the leader of that stable. And Farouk recognized this too, which was exactly why, over time, you could see him growing more and more frustrated at his underling. And as that was going on, we could also see The Rock's influence continuing to swell, to the point it became clear he was going to attempt to usurp the throne before long. How would that happen in the end? Well, on the March 30th, 1998 episode of Raw, the night after WrestleMania 14, Rocky, who was by this point the Intercontinental Champion, finally struck when he kicked Farouk out of his own group and proclaimed himself to be the new leader of the Nation of Domination. And with the other members appearing to be okay with this move, it meant there was no one to challenge his leadership going forward. Sure, Farouk would try to fight back, but now that he was on his own, these attempts proved futile as he simply wasn't able to overcome the power of the nation on his own. No, this was The Rock's world now, and with his crew behind him fully, there was no one that was going to stop him as he continued on with this rise. And where would that rise lead him? Well, to our next great angle of the Attitude Era as it happened, because it was later on in 1998 that the Great One shocked the world by joining the corporation themselves. Why was this one so surprising? Well, because in the lead up to 1998's Survivor Series, Rocky's popularity had grown so much that WWF were pretty much forced to turn him babyface, whether they liked it or not. And so with him heading into that show at such a high level of popularity that he was actually beginning to approach Steve Austin, it seemed unthinkable Vince McMahon would mess with this winning formula. But mess with it he would, because in the one-night Deadly Games tournament that was being held here to crown a new WWF champion after that belt had been vacated 2 months prior, both The Rock and Austin started the night off strong, only for this to change when the Rattlesnake was screwed in the semifinals, leaving fans with only one hope left to walk out the night as babyface champion. What no one saw coming, however, was that, in what probably still stands today as Vince Russo's finest hour, by the time the main event pitting the People's Champion and Mankind was over, it would indeed be the former who was the winner, though in order to win, he'd have turned heel and joined the very corporation he claimed to hate so much. Yes, it was the swerve to end all swerves, and it immediately set up Rocky as the corporate champion going forward. Was this an incredibly risky move? Sure. But it worked out gangbusters in the end, because for the next few months, the Great One absolutely killed it as the final boss villain of the show, with him repeatedly destroying Mick Foley during rematches between the pair, all in the lead up to that inevitable showdown with Steve Austin at WrestleMania 15. Of course, once that latter feud was over though, The Rock would have to be returned to the side of the babyfaces, because for as much as fans love his corporate heel character, there was just no way they were going to continue booing him for much longer. And so like that then, the time of The Rock's run with the corporation came to an end, as he instead returned to being the People's Champion. But it wasn't as if the McMahons would be without a main event level performer within the ranks for long, because by the time 1999 was over, there would be a whole new powerhouse duo in charge of the show, with this giving us the age of our next subject, the McMahon-Helmsley era. Now, most of you no doubt remember this one, but for those who don't, the McMahon-Helmsley era angle began in late 1999 when heel world champion Triple H began making it his mission to torment Vince McMahon at all costs. Hell, at one point, he took things so far that he even kidnapped Stephanie McMahon, then married her in a shotgun wedding in Vegas. Was this ridiculous even by Attitude Era standards? Sure, but it was entertaining nonetheless. And it was about to get even more entertaining because at Armageddon on December 12th of that year, after going to war with the boss himself in a brutal street fight, Triple H would reveal that Stephanie had been on his side all along. So began a whole new period for WWF then, one which would see Vince McMahon leave in shame as the Game and Stephanie took over the show, and given they were both heels, this spelled bad news for all the babyfaces around them, most specifically The Rock and Mick Foley. It didn't matter how much they fought back, the fact was all the power lay in the hands of the McMahon-Helmsley regime, and so that meant the world title was almost always around the Cerebral Assassin's waist here. And even when it wasn't, he and his wife were still the focus of the show as they threw their weight around and continued to dominate the proceedings, all the way up until Vince McMahon returned in the spring that was. Or at least it looked like things were going to change here. But once Vince revealed he was joining the McMahon-Helmsley regime at WrestleMania 16, it only strengthened their power that much more, with it taking a new on-screen commissioner in the form of Mick Foley to ultimately provide any sense of checks and balances for the heel stable and their decision-making. But by this point, it made all the sense in the world that Foley would be the man in that position, as earlier on in 2000, he and the Game had gone through a feud for the ages with one another, one which actually serves as our next subject, believe it or not. Yes, it's time to talk about Triple H versus Mick Foley. What a great feud this was. And it all began in late 1999 when, after being one of the few people who dared to challenge the McMahon-Helmsley regime, Mick Foley found himself in the crosshairs of Triple H and company. And given they had all the booking power at this point, it meant they had no qualms about making Mrs. Foley's baby boy's life a living hell going forward. Sure, they would end up being forced to give him a world title shot at that January's Royal Rumble as a result of shenanigans, but the Cerebral Assassin wasn't worried about this too much, as by that point, Mankind was so beaten up, so battered, it felt like it was obvious the heel champ would retain during their upcoming street fight at Madison Square Garden. One thing the game hadn't counted on, however, was that Foley still had an ace up his sleeve in the form of the most hardcore of hardcore legends. That's right, after memorably transforming into Cactus Jack on the January 13th, 2000 episode of SmackDown, Foley forced Triple H to confront the mistake he'd made, as now he was no longer fighting a happy-go-lucky guy. No, he was fighting a psychotic madman. The same psychotic madman who had completely destroyed him in a match on Raw a few years prior. What followed on from there then would be arguably the greatest match of the entire Attitude Era, Triple H versus Cactus Jack at the 2000 Royal Rumble. But while the King of Kings would win this one, it wasn't the end of the feud, because just 1 month later at No Way Out, there would be a rematch, this time inside Hell in a Cell, with the added stipulation being that if Foley failed to win here, he'd be forced to retire. Would he win? No. Sadly, this would mark the end of his full-time in-ring career because after a wild cell bout, it was the incoming champ who was still standing tall. Sure, Foley would return for one night at WrestleMania 16 in order to get the Mania main event he'd never gotten the chance to have before, but while this did briefly see the two rivals lock horns once more, by then the real heights of the story between them were already in the past. One story which was only just getting started that night, however, was our next one, as it was at WrestleMania 16 that we got the first in a series of era-defining tag team bouts pitting the Hardy Boys against not only the Dudley Boys, but also Edge and Christian. Yes, even the most casual of fans from back at the turn of the millennium will remember this one all too well, as it gave us three of the most spectacular wrestling matches ever seen at that point in time, the first of which came during the Triangle Ladder match at the aforementioned Mania 16. Why was this so spectacular? Well, because it involved all six men doing things no one had done before, at least not on such a big stage, as using ladders in every different way imaginable, they were able to put on a stunt show no one could take their eyes off of. Needless to say then, given the fan response to this one, it wasn't long before WWF began making plans to run it back, and the location they eventually chose to do this at would be August 2000's SummerSlam. This time, however, there would be an added twist, as it wouldn't just be a ladder match. No, additional weapons were added to the mix to make it a tables, ladders, and chairs match. Why tables, ladders, and chairs? Well, because each of these weapons represented one of the three teams involved, with tables being the specialty of the Dudleys, ladders being the forte of the Hardys, and chairs being what everyone associated with Edge and Christian. So when all this was combined into one bout then, it created something so special that it's still being talked about today. A bout which took years off of each man's career, but skyrocketed them towards superstardom in exchange for that. And that still wasn't the end of it either, because after TLC 1 ended with Edge and Christian getting the win, WWF realized that there was still more juice left to squeeze from the whole thing, with this being why a third and final showdown between the three teams was set for WrestleMania 17, a show still widely regarded to this day as the greatest wrestling pay-per-view of all time. Of course, for as much as the likes of Austin vs. Rock and McMahon vs. McMahon helped to make this show so iconic, a big part of the reason it's remembered as well as it is today is because TLC 2 is quite simply one of the greatest wrestling matches of all time. So good and so wild that there was no way anyone was ever going to be able to top it. And that made it the perfect place for this story to end then, as once it was over, all three teams went their own way for the most part, safe in the knowledge they'd made history and reinvigorated an entire division while they were at it. One thing they hadn't done, though, was bring the romance. Now, if you wanted this during the Attitude Era, then the best place to go was our next story, the story of Eddie Guerrero and Chyna. That's right, during the turn of the millennium, we all loved Latino heat. And it appears that love stretched beyond the fan base and into the locker room too, because come the spring of 2000, he was starting to win the affections of his mamacita, Chyna. Sure, this didn't happen overnight, as it took the ninth wonder of the world a while to be convinced that the scoundrel seeking her love had the right intentions. But when he finally did get her on his side, the two became something of a power couple in WWF, as with her being stronger than any of the other women there, and with him regularly lying, cheating, and stealing his way to victory, they became simply unstoppable. Or at least they were unstoppable whenever Eddie's roguish side wasn't coming to the forefront, and he was either seeking the attention of other women or getting jealous over the fact that his beau was doing a cover shoot for Playboy. Obviously then, for as in love as they were, these issues would become a little too much for Chyna to handle as time went on. And that all led to the sad but inevitable moment where they finally split up in autumn of the same year. Yes, it was a short-lived romance in the end, but a whirlwind one no one would soon forget. And it's not as if this marked the end for Chyna either, because once it was over, she would bounce back by rejoining the stable who serves as our next great subject today, the always great D-Generation X. Come on now, there was no way we were going to do a video on great angles of the Attitude Era and not cover DX, as throughout pretty much the whole thing, they were one of the most entertaining parts of both Raw and SmackDown on a weekly basis. It didn't matter if it was their initial incarnation in late 1997 and early 1998, one which included Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Chyna, and Rick Rude, or the second version which formed in the wake of HBK's retirement and saw X-Pac and the New Age Outlaws be brought on board. You could always count on this group of degenerates being the highlight of any segment they were involved in. Need any examples of what made them so memorable? How about the time they invaded WCW on a Jeep? Or the time they spent the summer of 1998 going to war with the Rock's incarnation of the Nation of Domination? And if that's not enough, how about the time they became, in many people's opinion, the shoot architects of the infamous Montreal Screwjob? Then, of course, there's the third run they had in 2000, the one where, now a heel unit once more, they were able to serve as a subgroup of the McMahon-Helmsley regime and throw their power about in a way it had never been seen before. Sure, we can all have our arguments over which version was better, the original group, the babyface DX Army, or the later heel version of that faction. But whatever side of this argument you fall on, there's no denying that D-Generation X were awesome, and that they were one of the key reasons the Attitude Era was as popular and successful as it was. And that's been clearly evident in the fact that as the decades have gone on, WWE have continually returned to them in order to get a nostalgia pop. But while they will still show up on WWE TV from time to time today, the real run of DX happened during that magical time that was the turn of the millennium. And it's just as well they did, because they, along with every other great storyline we've looked at today, were able to turn it into a period of wrestling history that will never be forgotten. The Indies have always been a fantastic breeding ground for great wrestlers over the years. Hell, if you look at most of the top superstars out there today, you'll find that before they ever reached the big leagues, they were first honing their craft somewhere like Ring of Honor, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, or Game Changer Wrestling. But not all indie darlings succeed once they make it to the top. No, some fail once they make it to WWE. But just who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with Scotty Goldman. Now, if you want to talk about wrestlers who have the spirit of the indies in them, then Scotty Goldman, or to go by his more well-known moniker, Colt Cabana, fits this bill better than almost anyone. After all, it was him who in many ways pioneered the wrestling podcasting game, something which has been a great source of income for many indie performers in the years since. But it wasn't just about podcasting with Colt. No, he was also great at working the more comedic style he utilized in the ring. So why didn't this translate when he was brought into WWE during the mid-2000s? Honestly, we're not sure. It's not as if his style wouldn't have fit right in with the WWE at the time, and it's not as if him having his name changed to Scotty Goldman at this point should have affected his ability to perform. No, there really is no reason for the Illinois native completely flopping here, other than the assumption that Vince McMahon just didn't take to him for whatever reason. After all, why else would Goldman have gotten so little TV time after making his true main roster debut in August of 2008? And why else would every appearance he did make seem designed specifically to make him look like a jobber who couldn't cut the mustard in the big leagues? Yes, the truth is, this may have been a case of the boss having a short attention span when it came to a new talent. So it was then that after eating some pinfall losses to the likes of Brian Kendrick, The Great Khali, and Umaga, Colt Cabana would be released from his contract in February of 2009. Still, at least from there, he was able to return to the Indies and eventually get a job in AEW. But what about our next subject? Another man who is currently signed with AEW, the man who gravity forgot, Adrian Neville. Of course, today Adrian Neville goes by Pac, the name he first used when he was making something of himself on the UK and European indie scenes during the mid to late 2000s. And it was the quality of his work during this time that first saw him fall under the radar of WWE, with him being signed there in 2012. What happened after this? Well, things went pretty well for a while, as on NXT, Neville reached the top of that card by becoming that brand's world champion. Once he was called up to the main roster in 2015, though, things took a bad turn, as now the Englishman was saddled with a gimmick of basically being Mighty Mouse in all but name. And as if that wasn't bad enough, rather than get pushed as a serious threat on Raw, he'd spend most of his time stuck in 205 Live and the WWE Cruiserweight division. Could he have been more? Absolutely he could have. But alas, despite being a Cruiserweight champion, he would never really get a chance to go any higher than this. And it appears that Neville himself wasn't happy with his booking, as in 2017 he'd walk out on the company, with him from there going on to join AEW. But not every indie star who doesn't work out in WWE goes over to AEW after the fact, and one of the best examples of this is our next subject, Kaval. Now, if you don't remember the name Kaval, you might remember the name Low Ki. That was the guy who was tearing it up in places such as Ring of Honor and TNA throughout the 2000s. In fact, so highly regarded was he in those places, he'd become the first ever world champion in the former. That said, all this didn't mean much when he joined WWE in 2008, as there, he'd have to prove himself to a whole new fan base, with him now going by the new name of Kaval. Who was Kaval? Well, he was a contestant on the second season of NXT back when it was in its original game show format. And with this format focusing more on wrestlers carrying out wacky tasks rather than showing what they could do in the ring, there was little opportunity for the Brooklyn native to show his primary skill set. Still, that didn't mean he didn't do well here. In fact, he actually won the whole thing. But as it turned out, this wasn't the springboard for a successful career in WWE that he'd hoped it would be. No, immediately after winning NXT Season 2, Kaval would be cast in the role of mid-card act who was essentially the lackey for LayCool. Sure, he would get a shot at Dolph Ziggler's Intercontinental title when he beat the champ in a non-title match, but that was about all the former ROH World Champion got on the main roster. And if rumors are to be believed, he was often getting into drama backstage, with this all not looking good for his future in WWE. So it was then that after getting into arguments with management, Kaval would be released from his contract in December of 2010, with this marking the last time he would ever appear in a WWE ring. And Low Ki wasn't the only indie darling whose apparent abrasive attitude ended up costing him his job in WWE, as a few years later, the same thing would happen with Austin Aries. Yes, you may have heard the stories of Austin Aries being a challenge to get along with behind the scenes, but that doesn't mean he isn't a great wrestler. And this was something he proved time and again through his work in places such as Ring of Honor, TNA, and Dragon Gate USA during the 2000s and the early part of the 2010s. So really, when he joined WWE in 2016, this should have been enough to get him a leg up in the company, as by that point, Triple H was well into his phase of hiring every indie star he could. But unfortunately, most of the other indie stars the game had hired were a lot easier to get along with. And so, because of that, Aries struggled to build any kind of noteworthy momentum during his time on the Black and Gold brand that year, and when he was called up to the main roster towards the end of 2016, things got even worse for him. Why was this? Well, despite being a part of the Raw roster, the Milwaukee native quickly fell into the trap of being an almost exclusive member of the Cruiserweight division. And this meant that, like with Adrian Neville, most of his time would be spent on 205 Live. And like with another indie star we've already discussed named Low Ki, Austin Aries was not shy about letting his feelings known when it came to his spot on the card, with this understandably causing him problems backstage. Sure, he did get to have some good matches during this period, matches against people like Tony Nese, Mustafa Ali, and Arya Daivari. The only problem was, because of the platform these matches were given, barely anyone knew they were taking place, even if they did want to check them out. And eventually, this led to frustrations bubbling over on both sides to the point that, on July 7th, 2017, Aries would be released from his contract, with him never showing up in a WWE ring again after that. Could things have worked out differently for him had he gotten along better with management? Maybe. But then maybe not, because few people have had anything negative to say about Cassius Ohno, and he still failed to get over in the WWE. Of course, Cassius Ohno will be better known to many fans as Chris Hero, stalwart of the indie scene throughout the 2000s and beyond. Seriously, during his time as an active performer, there's barely been a place he's not worked, whether that be ROH, TNA, PWG, or Chikara. Unfortunately for the wrestling genius though, no matter how good he might have been in these promotions, and no matter how much respect he might have gained from his peers while there, once he joined WWE in 2011, things didn't go so well for him. What happened here? Well, after spending a couple of years in developmental, the man now named as Cassius Ohno would be cut from his contract before he could ever even reach the main roster, with the reasons for this being that apparently WWE just didn't see any value in moving him up there, despite CM Punk pushing for him to be the original third man in the Shield alongside Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins. Sure, this might seem weird considering how good of an all-rounder the Ohio native is, but for one reason or another, management just didn't see much into him. And it wasn't like this would be Chris Hero's only run in WWE. No, after returning to the Indies for a few years, he'd get a second bite at the apple in 2016. That said, this time things wouldn't exactly go much better. Why was that? Well, once again, Cassius Ohno would be used as an NXT exclusive here, with him now pretty much serving the role as gatekeeper to other stars like Shinsuke Nakamura, Matt Riddle, and Andrade Cien Almas, right before they hit the main roster. And in 2020, he'd eventually find his time in WWE coming to an end once more, forcing him to return to the Indies, where he formally passed on his gimmick of the wrestling genius to Daniel Maccabee, all before he got a job as a backstage producer and coach with AEW in 2023. And while he was doing this, our next subject was finding his own way to WWE. Who are we talking about here? Why, Cameron Grimes, of course. Yes, we know there was a time where Cameron Grimes looked like he was going to be a star in WWE, as for a period during his NXT run at least, he was really starting to get over. But any momentum he'd been building with his rich hillbilly character down on the black and gold brand at the turn of the decade was sadly wasted once he was called up to the main roster in 2023. Why was that? Well, once there, it appears WWE just didn't have any real storylines for the North Carolinian to sink his teeth into, as after getting drafted to SmackDown and making his first appearance there on the May 12th episode of the show, Grimes wouldn't last much longer. No, less than a year later, he'd be out of the WWE for good, with him doing absolutely nothing of note during his main roster run. And that's a true crime then, because for anyone who'd been following his career on the Indies prior to this, back when he was going by the name of Trevor Lee, it was obvious he had it in him to be a big-time star on the grandest stage possible. After all, he certainly had the charisma, and he could undoubtedly go in the ring too, something which was evident in his time in both PWG and TNA, especially in the latter, as that was where he became a 3-time X Division champion. So why did WWE not see the potential in Trevor once he'd reached the blue brand then? That's hard to say. It's not as if they weren't aware of his skills. Hell, he was booked like a star on the developmental show. We guess this is one which will always go down as a bit of a mystery, but at least it's not been the end of Cameron Grimes' time in the wrestling world, as, now a free agent once more, he's recently begun the process of taking bookings out on the Indies again, something we hope will eventually see him land on his feet once more soon enough. It wouldn't be like it was the first time an indie darling with the surname Lee didn't work out in WWE and then had to go reinvent himself somewhere else, as the exact same thing happened with our next subject, Keith Bearcat Lee. Yes, that's right, we're using the infamous Bearcat moniker here because that's what Lee was given once he was called up to Raw in the summer of 2020, and this gimmick turned out to be an instant failure, something almost universally disliked by fans. And yes, the Bearcat moniker was at least to some degree a reference to Bearcat Wright, but this was never mentioned on TV. So if you didn't know the reference, then you would never know why the sudden change in name and ring gear. It's just a shame he never worked out. After all, here was a man who had not only been a massive hit on the Indies for years prior to his signing with WWE, someone who was good enough to regularly tear it up in places like Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and at one point even become their world champion. He was also someone who was good enough to excel in NXT. They're becoming a world champion too. In fact, he wouldn't just be a world champion in the black and gold brand, no, he'd be a double champ. As while holding that belt, the Wichita Falls native was also at one point in possession of the North American strap. Sadly though, as soon as Vince McMahon started booking him, any sense of star power Lee had seemed to dissipate in an instant. Needless to say then, after trading wins with Randy Orton, then being taken off of TV due to a serious health issue, Lee was finally released from his contract in November of 2020. How would he fare after this? Well, somewhat better, but still not great, unfortunately. And that's likely because his health issues seem to have left him a little more limited in terms of what he can do now, meaning that while he has become a tag team champion in AEW alongside Swerve Strickland, he's increasingly become a rare presence on their TV too. But what of the man the Texan was once so closely associated with during his time on the indie scene? Surely he would have a better run when he joined WWE in 2017. Well, unfortunately not, because that person is none other than our next subject, Dijak. That's right, Dijak. What could have been? Yes, it seemed like he was everything that Vince McMahon would have been looking for in a big-time star. So what went wrong then? Well, nothing at first. No, after spending the early years of his career working in places like Ring of Honor and putting on a series of classics against Keith Lee, the man then known as Dominik Dijakovic signed on the dotted line with the WWE and quickly started rising up the ranks of NXT. So well did he do in NXT, in fact, at one point he was entering into a feud for the North American title. Sadly though, when the time came to call him up to the main roster in the autumn of 2020, the Massachusetts native would be a victim of one of the worst gimmicks of all time, retribution. Yes, rather than call up Dijak as the tough guy badass he'd been down in developmental, when he eventually hit Raw, WWE would book him as a member of the most comically bad stable in recent memory, one who acted like rejects from the Foot Clan in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And his status in this group certainly wasn't helped by the fact that he now wore a ridiculous mask and went by the name of T-Bar. Obviously then, this was career death for the big man, at least in terms of his main roster run, so that was why he was moved back down to NXT again in 2022. But despite having a much better run here without the albatross of retribution weighing him down, it still wasn't enough to revive Dijak's fortunes in the long run, as just 2 years later he'd be released from his contract altogether. Where does he go from here? That remains to be seen, but we can't rule out the possibility of one final match between him and Keith Lee in AEW, or maybe even an eventual return to WWE one day before he retires. And with Triple H now booking the show, it's probable that he'd have a much better run a second time around. Either way though, he can at least rest easy knowing that he wasn't the only indie darling that never met their potential in WWE. No, this has been happening for years, and if you need any evidence of that, you only have to look to our next subject, Evan Bourne. Why did Evan Bourne fail to meet his full potential in WWE? Well, for one, he was never really seen as more than a mid-card guy at best, someone who, when he wasn't competing on the WWE CW brand, was reaching his ceiling as part of a tag team with Kofi Kingston named Air Boom. And yes, Air Boom were at one point WWE Tag Team Champions, but sadly, not many fans cared about the tag team titles in 2011. No, what the St. Louis native really needed back then was a solid singles run on a popular brand which might have allowed him to get some traction behind himself. After all, it's not like he wasn't capable of connecting with fans as we'd all seen him do in places like Ring of Honor, TNA, and Dragon Gate, but given he was under 6 feet in height and this was still during the Vince McMahon years, there was little hope that was going to happen. So instead of getting a main event opportunity then, Evan Bourne would mill around for a few years, doing little of note outside of taking an excellent RKO from Randy Orton on an episode of Raw, all before parting ways with the company in 2014. Thankfully though, he was able to bounce back after that, as now Matt Sydal, as he is known once more, has been able to rebuild himself on the indies, with this keeping him going all the way up until the modern day, with him now signed to a contract with AEW to serve as something of a player coach. And he's not the only indie darling who ended up doing work with AEW after a failed WWE run, as the exact same statement applies to our next subject too, Lio Rush. Really, if you want to talk about performers out there today who are undervalued, then Lio Rush has to be near the top of that list, as he's got such a unique style to him and such a fan-friendly way of working that it's hard to not be fully engaged whenever he's on screen. And these skills have been evident for a long time now, as far back as the mid to late 2010s in fact, when he was building a name for himself in places like Ring of Honor and Combat Zone Wrestling. But as we've seen so many times already today, being a great indie star doesn't necessarily mean you'll find success in WWE, especially not during the latter days of Vince McMahon. And sadly for Lio, it was during this time period that his WWE run happened, as he'd signed there in 2017. What would he do during this run? Well, like Adrian Neville and Austin Aries, he'd mostly be on 205 Live. Sure, he did get the occasional chance to appear in a better spot on the Red brand, but whenever he did, it was as a mouthpiece for Bobby Lashley, a role which didn't exactly show the high flyer in his best light. And when apparent backstage attitude problems made it difficult for certain members of the Raw roster to work with him, he'd be demoted back down to NXT again, the very place he'd remain up until the point he was released from his contract in April of 2020. Should he have been more in WWE? Maybe. But then maybe this one isn't entirely the company's fault, as if rumors are to be believed, those same backstage issues appear to have arisen with the Maryland native in other places since. But that doesn't mean he still couldn't have done more in WWE, as one thing you most certainly can't say about Lio Rush is that he isn't good enough in the ring. No, like with everyone else we've discussed today, he's an excellent performer who was able to use his talents to become a shining star on the indie scene for a while. But when that shot at the big time came, those talents just never managed to fully make it happen there. If you look at the current day rosters of Raw and SmackDown, most of the performers there have at some point passed through the halls of NXT. But then that shouldn't come as much of a surprise because this brand has served as WWE's developmental one for over a decade now. That said, not everyone who's ever performed there has managed to make it up to the main roster, but who are the most notable examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with perhaps the most notable example, the Undisputed Era. Why are the Undisputed Era the most notable example of a stable never getting the main roster call-up to WWE? Well, because during their time there between 2017 and 2021, they pretty much ran the show, with them at one point holding all the gold available to them. Yes, back at the end of the 2010s, there was no more dominating unit on the black and gold brand than that which was made up of Adam Cole, Kyle O'Reilly, Bobby Fish, and Roderick Strong. So devastating were they in their ability to control everything around them. In fact, many were hoping that when they did eventually get called up, they'd do so as a collective. In the end, this never happened though, because after their peak came during a period when Cole was NXT champion, Strong was North American champion, and O'Reilly and Fish were tag team champions, the Undisputed Era imploded when Cole and O'Reilly came to blows. And once that happened, it would be left to the other two members to pick sides themselves, meaning that the once dominating group was officially no more. Still though, they could have been called up to the main roster as solo acts anyway, right? Well, no. Because aside from one cameo appearance the NXT champion made on an episode of SmackDown to challenge Daniel Bryan, none of the four members would ever make it to either Raw or SmackDown. Why was this? Well, the reasons are different depending on who we're talking about. In Bobby Fish's case, for example, he was cut from his contract in August of 2021, with the feeling presumably being that he didn't quite have the same level of potential as a solo act. And when it came to Adam Cole and Kyle O'Reilly, they'd both choose not to sign new contracts with WWE once their existing ones expired, with both of them making the jump over to All Elite Wrestling soon thereafter. Obviously then, this was a big blow to Triple H, particularly in the case of Cole, as the game had obviously seen big things in his future. But that wouldn't be the end of the hard times for the boss as it happened, because once Roderick Strong's contract expired in 2023, he'd join his former stablemates in AEW too, with this marking the final nail in the coffin of the time of the Undisputed Era in WWE. Could things have gone differently? Sure, in a perfect world for Paul Levesque, he'd have all four on his roster today doing battle with other groups like the Bloodline and the Judgment Day. But things didn't work out that way, and the UE aren't the only former NXT acts who became All Elite before they ever joined Raw or SmackDown, as the same could be said about our next subject, CJ Parker. Don't remember CJ Parker? Well, maybe this name will sound more familiar. Juice Robinson. That's right, before he was a member of the Bang Bang Gang in AEW, hell, before he was even a member of the OG Bullet Club in New Japan Pro Wrestling, the husband of Toni Storm was working for NXT under the same name as Pamela Anderson's character from Baywatch. When did this happen? Well, it was a while ago in wrestling terms, as this was back in 2012. That was when Parker, then still a rookie, signed on the dotted line with WWE and was promptly shipped off to their developmental brand from there. And once there, after spending his first few months serving as a jobber to the likes of Roman Reigns, he eventually developed a hippie character, one which proved to be so unpopular with fans that he'd soon be forced to turn heel. Not that this heel turn did him much good in the long run though, because all it led to was Parker continuing his losing streak for the most part, with the list of people who'd beaten him eventually expanding to include performers like Adrian Neville, Kevin Owens, and Hideo Itami. And it was this last loss which proved to be the final straw for the Joliet native, as after doing the job to Kenta on the April 22, 2015 episode of NXT, he'd request his release from the company, with this being granted pretty quickly. And after this, he'd go to join the New Japan Dojo a few months later, where he'd begin his rise there, a rise which ultimately took him to the point he's at in his career now, with this being the role of on-screen sidekick to Switchblade Jay White. But let's move away from the men for a moment and focus on the ladies for a second, because there we find our next subject, Who are we talking about here? Why, Ty Conti, of course. That's right, back before she went by the name of Ty Mello, former member of the Jericho Appreciation Society and one half of TJ, Ty Conti was a rising star within the WWE system. And the reason she was considered to be such a rising star was because before she ever even stepped in the ring, she was already proving herself to be a very skilled athlete. How was she doing this? Well, by excelling in the world of judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the former of which even saw her enter the Olympic team trials for her home country at one point. Alas though, Conti would not end up going to the Olympics here. That said, such a thing proved to be a temporary gain for WWE in the end, because after seeing how much raw talent the Rio de Janeiro native had, they'd sign her up to a contract in 2016 and immediately ship her down to NXT, where it was hoped she would quickly rise up the ranks. As we all know now though, she wouldn't rise up high enough to ever make it to the main roster, because aside from a cameo appearance during the pre-show Women's Battle Royal at WrestleMania 34, Conti's time there never came. And so it was then that in April of 2020, she'd be part of a wave of mass releases, with her also moving on to sign with AEW at this point. So things worked out in the end then, just as they did for our next subject too, though in his case it worked out in a slightly different way, as despite having to retire before he could ever hit a main roster ring, former NXT star Corey Graves was at least able to stay within WWE's system as a commentator. Yes, given how much time he spent behind the booth, it's easy to forget that Corey Graves' career actually began with him performing as a wrestler, and this was something he'd actually been doing on the indies for over a decade before he ever even signed with WWE in 2011. So when he did sign at this point, it was expected that big things were in his future, especially as he had the look and could clearly do the talking part of the job too. Ultimately though, things never worked out that way because despite spending a few good years on the developmental brand while it was in the process of transferring over from Florida Championship Wrestling to NXT, Graves' time as an active in-ring performer came to a premature end before he could ever reach the main roster. Why was this? Well, sadly, because of concussions. Sure, in a different time this might not have stopped him, but in the more health-conscious mid-2010s, there was no way WWE doctors were going to let the Pittsburgh native continue on wrestling when they realized the damage a series of concussions picked up in matches against the likes of Eric Rowan, CJ Parker, and Oliver Gray had done to him. Luckily for Graves though, he still had those verbal skills to fall back on, and so that was why after formally announcing his retirement in December of 2014, he'd find a new role as a pre-show panelist and eventual commentator, with it being this latter role he still continues on with to this day as one of the voices of SmackDown. Would it have been nice to see him still able to wrestle? Sure, but at least he got to keep going on as a truly great announcer, the same of which cannot be said of his former tag team partner, Jake Carter. Now, Jake Carter might be a name many current fans don't remember because he was only actually active as a wrestler for a few years at the start of the 2010s, with none of his matches happening on main roster WWE. Now, aside from a few appearances in Japan, Carter's entire run would be spent down in Florida Championship Wrestling and NXT, the very places he served as one half of a duo with Corey Graves. And the fact he never went any higher than this is something of a tragedy then, because he certainly had the pedigree in his blood. After all, we're talking about a man who is the son of the late, great Vader. Yes, being the child of a legend can be a hard thing to live up to, but Carter certainly seemed ready to rise to the occasion when he signed with WWE in 2011. Unfortunately though, despite winning the FCW Florida Tag Team titles early on in his run, things started to fall apart for the Denver native soon thereafter, as once things shifted over to NXT and he and Corey Graves eventually parted ways, Carter would quickly find himself getting lost in the shuffle amongst other, more impressive talents like Seth Rollins, Adrian Neville, and Big E. And that was why, by the time September of 2013 came around, he'd be cut from his contract without much fanfare, with him only making 2 more indie appearances after that, one of which saw him team up with his father. Could he have been something on the main roster if he was given more time to develop? Possibly. It's hard to say now. But even if he did end up being good enough, the sad reality is that there are only so many spots available, and so some talented people just aren't going to be able to make it. No, when it comes to wrestlers like Jake Carter, they'll go down as what-ifs rather than world champions, and while that is a sad thing in some respects, at least he got a brief chance to show what he could do in WWE's developmental brands. And as it happens, around the same time he was doing this, the son of another legend was doing the exact same thing, with this person being none other than Richie Steamboat. Yes, Richie Steamboat is the son of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, one of the greatest pure babyfaces in wrestling history. And so, with such big shoes to fill then, Richie would have been forgiven for not meeting those same lofty standards. Luckily for his fans though, that wasn't going to stop him from trying, with his efforts soon gaining the attention of WWE and leading to them signing him to a contract in 2009. What happened after this? Well, the Steamboat son quickly impressed everyone with his in-ring talents while performing as part of Florida Championship Wrestling, with him here proving to be a chip off the old block. And all that led to much success in the developmental brand then, success which included not only wins over the likes of Wade Barrett, Kurt Hawkins, and Derek Bateman, but also championship gold when in March of 2011, he teamed up with Seth Rollins to defeat then FCW Florida Tag Team Champions Titus O'Neil and Damian Sandow. Hell, at one point, Richie would even get to team up with his own father to take on the Dude Busters duo of Trent Beretta and Kalen Croft, so there was every reason to believe that his future was bright. In the end though, like with Corey Graves, injuries would put a stop to the North Carolinian's career before he could ever reach the heights of Raw or SmackDown. How did these injuries come about? Well, not long after he won the FCW Jack Briscoe 15 Championship from Damian Sandow in January of 2012, and then the FCW Florida Heavyweight Championship from Rick Victor on top of that in July of that same year, the brand would fold and would be revamped as NXT. And while it was initially hoped that Steamboat would find the same level of success in NXT, in late 2012, he'd suffer a back injury which ended up being so severe that he'd be forced to announce his retirement from the ring forever. And while peers of his like Corey Graves were able to transition from the ring over to places like the commentary booth, for one reason or another, this was never an option for the Son of the Dragon. So like that then, his career came to an untimely end as any hopes of him ever making it to the main roster were cut short. But let's move away from sad retirements for a moment and back over to happier stories, because in the case of our next subject, she continues to perform today. Before she was part of the AEW roster as Taya Valkyrie though, it was all about a brief run on NXT as Frankie Monet. Now, by the time she signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2011, Kira Magnan Forster was no stranger to the ring. No, by that point, she'd already spent a decade or so honing her craft in places like AAA, Lucha Underground, and Impact Wrestling, and so this was why big things were expected of her when her time with the Fed began, as fans hoped she was going to be given every opportunity to succeed, and from there, eventually make her way up to the main roster. Sadly though, the British Columbia native signing with WWE happened at around the point it was just about ready to transfer into its 2.0 era, where the company were looking to sign young talents they could train from the ground up. Sure, for someone as talented as Taya Valkyrie, there was still a chance she'd be able to flourish in this system regardless, but it was certainly an anchor around her waist right when she needed it the least. And in the end, this proved to be an anchor which was too heavy, because under the new gimmick of Frankie Monet, she never quite got over with fans, with the most notable thing she did during her few months there being to challenge Raquel Gonzalez for the NXT Women's Championship. And sadly then, when a further round of the dreaded budget cuts was announced in November of 2021, her name would be on the list, with this hampering any hopes she ever had of making it to the main roster one day. Not that it was the end of the world though, because after finding herself briefly out of a job, Taya Valkyrie was able to bounce back by returning to work for places like Impact and AAA, all before eventually joining her husband Johnny TV in signing with AEW in 2023. And there, she's recently been given a chance to shine as part of the Ring of Honor roster, AEW's sister brand. But the former Frankie Monet is not the only woman from that time period who had to rebuild again after a short run on NXT 2.0, as the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, Persia Pirotta. Yes, this was another all too brief spell someone spent with NXT. That's right, after first making something of a name for herself on the Australian Indies, this Sydney-born performer got signed up to a contract with WWE in March of 2021. And there, after being given an all-new name to work with, she was quickly thrust into the 2.0 era of NXT, where she was introduced to fans as the friend of Indy Hartwell, someone who had traveled all the way from the land down under in order to attend the wedding of Hartwell and Dexter Lumis. Where would she go from there? Well, she'd stick around for a while longer and even at one point team with her kayfabe bestie to take on duos like Toxic Attraction and then NXT Women's Tag Team Champions Io Shirai and Zoe Stark. Sure, she wouldn't win these matches, but at least it was enough to establish Pirotta to an all-new audience. And it was hoped that as time went on, she'd eventually make her way up to either Raw or SmackDown under this new character too. But alas, before that could happen, she'd find herself also being a victim of the dreaded budget cuts, and from there, move over to TNA, where she reverted back to her real name of Steph De Lander. That said, in Impact, she's been able to find success, with her recently even getting to challenge Jordynne Grace for the Knockouts World Championship. Does this prove that WWE missed the boat on her by not sending her up to the main roster? Maybe. But then, as we've seen already, sometimes when they've tried to ease people up to Raw or SmackDown via cameo appearances, it still hasn't worked out. And this can also be seen with our next two subjects, Valentina Feroz and Yulisa Leon. Who are Valentina Feroz and Yulisa Leon? Well, they're two women who signed with WWE at the turn of the decade, with the former moving over from her native Brazil to join the NXT roster in 2019, all while the latter came over from Mexico to do the same in 2021. And given how well they seemed to match up at this point, it wasn't long before WWE decided to have them start working as a tag team, with their early bouts taking place not only on 2.0, but also on shows such as 205 Live. That said, we are not counting 205 Live as their main roster cameo here. No, that show was always a few rungs below Raw and SmackDown. What we are instead counting as their brief foray up on the big leagues is the time where, on the May 19th, 2023 episode of SmackDown, they showed up to challenge NXT Women's Tag Team Champions Glasgow's own Alba Fire and Isla Dawn. Unfortunately for the rookies, however, not only would they lose this match, but they'd also find their WWE dreams coming to a very definitive end soon thereafter, as mere months later, both would be released from their contracts. And what a shame this was for Feroz and Leon then, because since that point, the former is yet to reappear anywhere else, with it being entirely possible she has now decided to retire from the ring altogether. When it comes to the latter though, she has since returned to her native Mexico to wrestle on some indie shows, so there's still a possibility she has a bright future ahead of her inside the squared circle. But what about our next subject, a man who never got beyond NXT while working in WWE, Harland? Yes, the man who was once praised via a tweet from Paul Heyman, in which he called Harland the next big thing of WWE. That's right, it seemed like Parker Boudreaux was destined for big things when he had signed with NXT, fresh off of a successful college career where he played for the UCF Knights. All he had to do then was transfer these skills over from the gridiron to the squared circle, but as we all know, just being good in one sport doesn't necessarily mean you'll be good in another. And it certainly didn't help Boudreaux get over when, upon signing with WWE, he was immediately given the gimmick of Harland, a mute henchman who did little more than stand in the corner of Joe Gacy and try his best to look spooky. Obviously then this one didn't work out, and so it was then that after only 4 months on the roster, he'd be released in April of 2022. What did he do following this? Well, he spent a brief spell with AEW wrestling mainly on Dark as part of the Trustbusters, and has since been released from the company. That said, at least Harland may decide to continue wrestling in the future, the same of which cannot be said for our next subject because following his brief run in NXT, he's since retired. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Bull Dempsey? Yes, before there was Charlie Dempsey, there was Bull Dempsey, a relatively short-lived character on NXT between 2013 and 2016, and this character would be played by a Brooklyn-born journeyman going by the name of James Smith, someone who no doubt felt overjoyed when he signed with the promotion at that point, as he must have sensed his big break finally coming. Unfortunately for him though, this wasn't exactly the way things worked out in the end, because after spending his first couple of years there going on something of an undefeated streak by beating the likes of Aiden English and Simon Gotch, his star began rapidly falling somewhere around 2015. Why did things fall apart so much here? Well, it appears WWE just didn't see the improvement they were looking for in the big man. And so that was why, after making a pseudo-main roster appearance at WrestleMania 31 Access, where he attempted to qualify for that year's Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, his gimmick would change to that of a formerly out-of-shape man who had suddenly gotten healthy through the power of BullFit, his own personal training regime. Not that such a training regime did him much good in the long run though, because by the time 2016 came around and some of the bigger names of NXT like Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, and Finn Balor were all being called up to the main roster, Dempsey found himself in danger of being cut from his contract altogether, with this ultimately being what happened to him that February after his last televised appearance saw him get absolutely annihilated by Samoa Joe. And so then came the end of his run in NXT, with the big man only doing another year or so's worth of indie appearances before retiring altogether. It's just a shame Bull Dempsey couldn't have hung around for a little while longer then, because if he had, he could have followed in the footsteps of NXT's greatest ever extra, Blue Pants. Who was Blue Pants? Well, she was Leva Bates, the woman who would later go on to become an OG member of the AEW roster when that company formed in 2019. Before this, though, she was best known for her time on the Black and Gold brand, as it was there she became something of a cult phenomenon. And the way she became such a cult phenomenon was by, you guessed it, notably wearing blue pants down to the ring whenever she made appearances. Sure, she wasn't supposed to get over initially. No, she was only ever supposed to be an enhancement talent, hence the lack of an actual name. But after managing to get fans down in Full Sail University on her side anyway, it wasn't long before Triple H started calling her back with increased frequency, with this eventually leading to her picking up wins over the likes of Carmella, all while also getting to mix it up with bigger name stars such as Sasha Banks, Alexa Bliss, and Nia Jax. In the end, though, for as popular as this character was down in NXT, it doesn't appear there was ever any real consideration given to carrying it over to the main roster. And so that was why, after running her course on the developmental brand, Blue Pants would part ways with NXT in 2015, with her from there returning to the indies for a few years, all before eventually becoming All Elite right as the decade came to a close. One person who never became All Elite after they left WWE, though, is our next subject, the Velveteen Dream. Yes, back during the mid to late 2010s and even into the start of the 2020s, there were few people in wrestling who seemed to have a brighter future than the Velveteen Dream. And that's because this creation of Patrick Clark's, that of an androgynous, prince-esque character, felt truly unlike anything else that was going at the time. Hell, it was this uniqueness which saw fans get so behind him en masse, with such fan support eventually leading to the Dream having a breakout feud with Aleister Black, all before then going on to win the North American Championship from Johnny Gargano in January of 2019. So at this point, it should have been a case of just transferring him up to the main roster and letting him do his thing there, right? Unfortunately, though, after getting into a controversy outside the ring, Patrick Clark was released from his contract, and since his exit from NXT, he's only made one solitary indie appearance under the slightly altered name of the Velveteen Man. But the fact the Velveteen Dream never got a shot on Raw or SmackDown shouldn't be considered a mark on the developmental brand, and the same could be said about many others we've discussed today too, as they've shown that you can still make a memorable career in NXT alone. Wrestling has always been an industry which has utilized special attractions, those acts who don't need to be there on a week-to-week basis, but whenever they do show up, always garner some interest. Hell, this has been a staple of the business for decades now, going all the way back to the territory days. But who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with quite literally the biggest of them all, Andre the Giant. Yes, at a mammoth 7'4" in height, Andre the Giant was larger than life in every sense of the word. And this made him a very special attraction for any wrestling promoter looking to utilize him back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Really, the template was easy to work with back then for the Frenchman. Go somewhere like Memphis, wow crowds with his size, all while feuding with a top star for a while, and then after he was done with that, move on to a place like the AWA where he could rinse and repeat. That said, given the fact Andre's agent back in the day was none other than Vince McMahon Sr., it meant the bulk of his more famous moments would take place in the WWF, the company which served as sort of a home base to him during his peak years. And this would mean that as the 80s rolled around and Andre started breaking down physically, it would be in Vince McMahon Jr.'s WWF that he'd stay. Obviously then, this gave WWF a great tool to play with, and no better was Andre utilized than at WrestleMania 3 when he turned heel and challenged Hulk Hogan for the world title in what was, at the time, probably the biggest wrestling match ever put on. Sadly though, after doing the job to the Hulkster here, the Giant would be forced to seriously slow down, as by then his gigantism was becoming too much for his body to bear. So for the next few years, he becomes someone who mostly appeared in tag bouts whenever he did show up, allowing fans the chance to at least see him do his thing. And that's the position he would remain in all the way up until the point he sadly passed away in January of 1993. Will there ever be another special attraction on the level of Andre the Giant? Well, maybe there won't ever be someone quite on that same level again. But that isn't to say there aren't plenty of other people like him who have played a similar role over the years. In fact, you can even see a similar situation playing itself out today with our next subject, Omos. Now, Omos might not be someone people tend to talk about in the same breath as Andre the Giant, but there are a lot of similarities between the two, with the primary similarity being their size. That's right, at 7'3", this Nigerian absolutely towers over everyone he's put inside of a ring with. Needless to say then, this was something which served him well during his prior career as a college basketball player, and it would serve him even better once the time came for him to lace up his boots and enter the squared circle. No, Omos is unlikely to become a workhorse in the vein of a Shawn Michaels or a Bret Hart, but then he probably shouldn't be, as his real value is in showing up from time to time and making an impact whenever he does. After all, this kind of utilization is exactly what will make him so special. It worked to some extent during his early WWE main roster run, teaming up with AJ Styles at the beginning of the 2020s, and it also worked after he was taken on as a client by MVP for a while. Of course, since that relationship with MVP came to an end though, Omos has been largely absent from WWE TV. Where has he been? Well, for at least part of his time, he's been over in Japan working for Pro Wrestling Noah, one of WWE's current business partners. And it was here that he first really showed he had it in him to be a true main event star, as following him joining up with Team 2000X, he'd team with Jack Morris to become a GHC Tag Team Champion. Yes, in his short time out east, Omos was able to make quite a splash and become quite a hit with fans there, so much so that rather than drop the belts upon returning to America, he'd simply vacate them as nobody could beat him. Will this momentum as a special attraction be able to continue now that he's returned stateside? We guess we'll have to wait and see, because as of the time of this video's recording, he's yet to make his main roster return. That said, we are sure this will happen eventually, and when it does, Omos will offer WWE a prime opportunity to make a new superstar who can carry on at least a little bit of the legacy of someone like Andre the Giant. Now, we're not saying the big man has to become world champion or anything, but at least he should be a fearsome figure whenever he does appear, and in keeping with his special attraction status, those appearances should be spaced out so that they have maximum impact. Hell, it's not as if the WWE doesn't know how to book a big star who only shows up occasionally, because for the last decade or so, they've been doing exactly this with our next subject, the man who goes by the name of Brock Lesnar. Of course, it wasn't always this way for Brock. No, back during his initial run in WWE during the early 2000s, he was very much a full-time performer, someone who showed up on SmackDown every week to ply his craft and have memorable feuds with the likes of Kurt Angle and Eddie Guerrero. But by the time 2004 rolled around and he realized he was completely burnt out with the brutal WWE schedule, Brock decided to cut bait and try out his hands at other interests. What interests would these be? Well, after a brief spell on the gridiron, Brock would make himself something close to a household name when he entered the Octagon and became a UFC heavyweight champion in only his fourth professional fight when he beat Randy Couture by TKO. What relevance does this have to his special attraction status inside of a wrestling ring? Well, being a legitimate UFC champion meant that when he returned to WWE in 2012, he'd have an aura of legitimate danger unlike anyone else, as everyone watching knew just how tough he was. And that was exactly why it was him who was chosen to not only end The Undertaker's WrestleMania streak in 2014, but also to absolutely destroy John Cena a few months later in one of the most one-sided squashes in wrestling history. Sure, he wouldn't be there every week. Hell, sometimes we'd go months without seeing the Beast, even when he was holding on to the WWE title. But in the end, all that served to do was heighten the myth around him so that whenever he did show up, it really felt like the final boss had arrived. And that in turn always guaranteed a big box office return, as his appearances drew in a ton of interest from fans all over the world. Just look at Brock's feuds with the likes of Seth Rollins, Roman Reigns, and Cody Rhodes, just to name a few. Each of these followed the exact same pattern of having Brock make an impact in a short space of time, get the fans interested, and then disappear again for a while once it was over. That said, with it seeming like he might be gone from WWE for good now, there is a chance his latest appearance to Job to the American Nightmare at August 5th, 2023 SummerSlam could be his last. But even if this is the case, he'll remain one of the biggest special attractions the company had for the years he was around. After all, we're talking about the man who broke the streak here. And if he ever decides to make a late career return to UFC, we could see him being a big-time attraction there all over again too, as he still has a lot of star power with that audience. But what of the man whose streak he ended? Isn't he a big-time special attraction too? Why, yes he is, and that's why our next subject is none other than The Undertaker. Of course, like with Brock Lesnar, The Undertaker's special attraction status wasn't always built on the idea that he was a part-time. No, while this was a role he'd settle into later on in his career, early on during the 90s and even the 2000s, he was very much a week-to-week performer. But even when he was there every week, Mark Calaway remained someone who felt special. And the reason for this was because his character was so unique and so protected. Yes, this is someone who barely even sold a lick of offense until about 1996. As you can imagine then, this all made the dead man feel like he stood out from everyone else on the roster. And that put him in a position where he never needed something like a world title. No, all he needed was just to be there and get audiences invested in his character. So well would this work for him. In fact, there were several points where he felt like a bigger deal than the actual world champion, and that would be something which would continue whether we were talking about his zombie mortician incarnation, his Lord of Darkness one, or his American Badass Biker from the early 2000s. Eventually though, the toll that working at a main event level for so many years took on his body meant Calaway would have to begin winding down as he entered more of a part-time schedule. But when this happened, it only made him that much more of a special attraction because, with him now sometimes only appearing once a year for WrestleMania season, it meant his dates would get a lot more interest as fans knew how rare they were. Even after his streak ended, in fact, he remained someone audiences were always interested in seeing. And that feeling amongst the fan base continues on today post-retirement, something which can be seen in his cameo appearances at the likes of WrestleMania 40. Yes, while he might be done in the ring now, The Undertaker can remain a special attraction within WWE for decades yet, so long as he's still happy to pop up from time to time and deliver a chokeslam or two. Seriously, is it really that unreasonable to think he'll still be making appearances by the time WrestleMania 50 comes around? This is, after all, someone who many thought would be done in the ring by the time the early 2000s came around. No, we fully expect the Phenom to be here for a long time to come yet, serving as a special attraction even in retirement. Who knows, maybe this will even one day see him come face to face with our next subject, Logan Paul. Yes, Logan is someone who built his name on being an attraction on social media platforms like Vine and YouTube, with him there becoming a very notable figure indeed. And come the late 2010s, this notoriety was big enough that it allowed him to branch out into the world of combat sports, first in a series of celebrity boxing matches between 2018 and 2023. For the purposes of today's video though, it's not his time in the boxing ring we want to focus on. Rather, it's his time in the wrestling ring. Yes, it was in 2021 that Logan made his first appearance inside of a WWE ring, and it was less than a year after this that he'd officially sign a contract with the company to become an in-ring performer, with his first match happening at WrestleMania 38 when he teamed with The Miz to defeat Rey and Dominic Mysterio. Sure, he might not be there every week, but like with Brock Lesnar, this part-time status has given him that feeling of a special attraction whenever he does show up, and that has allowed him to have further notable feuds with the likes of Roman Reigns, Ricochet, and Kevin Owens. Hell, more than that, it's even allowed him to win some gold, as it was on November 4th, 2023 at Crown Jewel that he'd defeat Rey Mysterio to become United States Champion. Where would Paul go from there? Well, he'd defend this belt for the next several months. 273 days in total, in fact, with him even managing to score a match with Cody Rhodes during this period. Of course, his time as US champion would eventually come to an end though, and that would occur when at SummerSlam on August 3rd, 2024, he'd do the job to fan favorite LA Knight. But that hasn't been the end of Logan Paul. No, he continues to show up from time to time as a special attraction, and that's the way it looks like he's going to be doing things for a while yet. Hell, given some of his recent appearances, we really wouldn't be surprised to see him enter into a feud with CM Punk before 2025 is over. And after that, maybe it'll be more world title challenges, or maybe he'll go down to NXT for a while and work with that roster too. Since he isn't really tied to any one particular brand on account of his part-time status, there's no reason the YouTube star can't spend some time in NXT working with the likes of Trick Williams and Oba Femi. If we are being honest though, he'll probably remain on the main roster, and that means he might one day come face to face with another celebrity wrestler who's made quite a splash in WWE over the last couple of years, the one, the only, Bad Bunny. Yes, ever since he first broke out in a big way in 2018 after doing a guest verse on Cardi B's I Like It, he's been one of the biggest hip-hop stars out there. And this is particularly impressive since he raps largely in his native tongue, Spanish, something which rarely gets as much interest with English-speaking audiences. But that's not the reason we're talking about Bad Bunny today. No, the reason we're talking about him is because as a lifelong wrestling fan, it was always his dream to get involved in the industry in some way. And his dream would eventually become a reality for him, as it would be at the 2021 Royal Rumble that he'd make his first appearance at a WWE show to perform his hit Booker T, all while Booker was standing right there next to him, of course. Where would he go next? Well, finding that he liked appearing at WWE shows, Bad Bunny took things a step further when he actually began training for an in-ring debut, a debut which would happen at WrestleMania 37 when he teamed with Damian Priest to take on The Miz and John Morrison in a tag team bout. And after having a shockingly good showing here given his lack of experience and the fact that he wasn't an athlete, the Puerto Rican would continue to make sporadic appearances for the company as a special attraction in the years following. Now, as far as we can tell, he's never been under contract or anything, but this hasn't stopped him from showing up whenever his schedule has allowed it, and it's clearly a labor of love for him. And it's this passion which has seen him wow audiences at shows like the 2022 Royal Rumble, WrestleMania 39, and most notably Backlash 2023, where he had his first and only singles match to date. Yes, in front of his home country of Puerto Rico, Bad Bunny would take on Damian Priest at this show in a San Juan street fight, and in doing so, he absolutely stole the show. Seriously, go back now and watch that one for the entrance alone where he comes out to his own hit, Chambea, all while the capacity crowd sings along with every word. Has he made appearances since then? Not yet, but given he is still on good terms with WWE, we expect he'll make another appearance sooner rather than later, and when he does, he'll feel like just as much of a special attraction as he did before. That said, Bad Bunny is far from the first celebrity outsider who came over to the world of wrestling and made himself a big-time special attraction in the process. No, this kind of thing has been going on for decades now. And one of the most notable early examples of this phenomenon would happen in 1985 when Mr. T arrived in WWF. Now, you all know who Mr. T is. After all, he's a bona fide pop culture icon of the 80s whose performances in things like the A-Team and Rocky III turned him into a household name for a while back then. And as it happens, it would be while filming Rocky III that the Chicago native would first cross paths with Hulk Hogan. Not that they'd be aligned in this one, of course. No, the pair wouldn't be aligned on screen until 1985, as that was when Vince McMahon decided to bring the Hollywood star into his company for a special appearance. Why was he doing this? Well, this was when he was planning WrestleMania 1, a show he hoped would introduce a far larger audience to his new idea of sports entertainment. And in order to catch people's attention, he rolled out the red carpet for a number of celebrities. But while people like Cyndi Lauper, Muhammad Ali, and Liberace would all appear at the inaugural WrestleMania, only one celeb would actually take part in a match, and that person would be Mr. T. That's right, in order to really sell the main event as being can't miss, Vince had booked a tag team bout which would see then WWF champion Hulk Hogan team up with Mr. T in order to fend off the challenge of Rowdy Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Would this strategy work? Why, yes it would. It would work gangbusters, in fact. So much so that WWF would skyrocket into the mainstream and Mr. T would be brought back again for WrestleMania 2, this time in order to take part in a worked boxing match with the Hot Rod. And that wouldn't be the last time Mr. T appeared in a wrestling ring either. No, while it would mark his last match in WWF, he'd make further appearances for their chief competitor at the time, World Championship Wrestling, during the mid-90s in a special guest enforcer role. And the reason he was making these appearances was because by that point the Hulkster had jumped ship and had joined the competition. Still, even if he wasn't in WWE's good graces for a while on account of this, it wouldn't stop the company from inducting him into their Hall of Fame in 2014 on account of just how important he was as a special attraction in helping to ensure that the first WrestleMania was the success it needed to be in order for the company to survive and thrive into the present day. But what if you're not a celebrity? Hell, what if you're not even a part-timer? Can you still be a special attraction then? Well, the answer to that question is yes, you can, but in order to do so, you have to be someone as special as our next subject, the Road Warriors. Ever heard of the term Road Warrior Pop? It was created specifically to describe the absolutely outrageous reactions Hawk and Animal would get from live crowds every time they came out through the curtain during their heydays of the 80s. All you had to hear were the first strains of Black Sabbath's Iron Man, and you knew you were in for something special. And the reason you knew this was because, even if they were week-to-week characters in places like Jim Crockett Promotions or the AWA, their aura was so strong that it never got old to see them do their thing. That's right, there's a reason many to this day consider the Road Warriors to be the greatest tag team of all time. Still don't believe us? Just look at the pandemonium that was caused whenever they headed out east to Japan and engaged in their trademark style of no-selling their opponent's offense, all while stiffing the ever-loving hell out of them in a way that only two legitimate tough guys like them could do. And if that's not enough, just look at the multiple runs they had in WWE, the most famous of which was probably their first one between 1990 and 1992, where now working under the name of the Legion of Doom, they quickly became the tag team champions. Really, it's still incredible to think that two people could feel like such special attractions despite never actually being special attractions at all on account of the fact they were always there. But then we guess that's just the power of the Road Warriors, and their star power would remain strong even into their later, less well-received runs, with this meaning that even if they weren't at their peaks anymore by the time the Attitude Era came around, they still remained wildly over with live crowds. Hell, even when Hawk passed away in 2003, Animal was able to keep the legacy of the Road Warriors alive for a while yet with a variety of different partners. Sadly though, with him also passing in 2020, it means the legacy of the team really is now set, and there will never be any further additions to it. No, from here on in, the story of Hawk and Animal is firmly carved in stone, and that stone says they're maybe the greatest special attraction of their era, possibly even more than Andre the Giant. But then maybe they're not quite the best because there is another notable territory star who can challenge them for this spot. And that person is our next subject as it happens. Who are we talking about here? Why, Abdullah the Butcher, of course. Yes, back during the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, there were few, if any, people in the wrestling industry more feared than Abdullah the Butcher. That's right, if you thought Mick Foley was being too wild during the 90s when he was getting thrown off of cages, you haven't seen anything yet, because back during the territory days, Abby was taking things to such levels of violence it was too much for many in the crowd to bear. Needless to say then, this made Abdullah's appearances a hell of a special attraction, and this was something he knew all too well, which was exactly why he never stayed in one place for too long. Though back during a time when moving from territory to territory every so often was the norm, the Ontario native would follow the Andre the Giant template of showing up somewhere like World Class Championship Wrestling, causing an absolute spectacle, then moving on to somewhere else like All Japan. And this allowed him to create an aura around himself like no other, as the legend of Abdullah the Butcher became comparable in some fans' minds to the stories of horror characters. Not that this stopped people from showing up though. No, there was always too much of a curiosity with seeing the massacre unfold. And boy, was it a massacre anytime the big man hit the ring. Anyone who's ever been on the receiving end of his trusty fork will attest to that. Obviously then, being so violent meant Abby never got a run somewhere like WWF during their more child-friendly golden era, and that meant he never achieved the same level of mainstream fame as some of his peers did. But this, in many ways, only added to his legend as a boogeyman of the industry, someone who is too wild and too dangerous for TV for the most part. That said, even if he never was a fixture in New York, he'd still get inducted into WWE's Hall of Fame in 2011, mostly as a show of respect to just how much of an attraction he was back when he was doing his thing all over the world to a level of gruesomeness no one else could match. But let's move away from the territory days for now and back over to something closer to the present day, as it's there we find our next entry, someone who managed to have the dual role of being a regular character under the guise of Bray Wyatt, all while simultaneously being a special attraction whenever he adorned himself in the mask of The Fiend. Now, wrestlers having alter egos is nothing new to the industry. Hell, even wrestlers having spooky alter egos is something which has been happening for decades. But few people have ever managed to do this as effectively as Wyndham Rotunda did back during the late 2010s and early 2020s. And the reason we say this is because it was after his career was derailed following the questionable booking of his original Bayou cult leader character that he took some time off, recalibrated, and came back with a whole new act. What was this act? Well, it was that of a horror movie monster known as The Fiend, a figure of nightmares who served as the dark id to Bray's more fun-loving Mr. Rogers-style children's TV host. And that reinvention proved to be a huge hit with fans, so much that it completely turned things around for the then struggling star. So much would it turn things around, by the time 2019 was over he'd be WWE champion after defeating Seth Rollins for the honor at Crown Jewel. And even after he lost that belt to Goldberg a few months later, he'd be able to bounce back when at WrestleMania 36 he gave us the Firefly Funhouse match, a twisted journey into the psyche of his opponent for the evening, John Cena. Obviously then, a big part of the reason The Fiend was so successful was because he was used so sparingly, never really appearing on a weekly basis. No, he basically served the role of Bray's nuclear option, something he'd pull out for pay-per-views or whenever he needed to lay someone out on weekly TV. And that kept the aura of the character strong all the way until Wyatt was released from his contract in July of 2021. Would we see The Fiend again after that? Not really, though we would see Bray as he would return to WWE in 2022 with an all-new gimmick of a man being haunted by the mysterious Uncle Howdy. Sadly though, with him having since passed away, it means there's no hope of a Fiend revival in the future, no matter how much fans might want this. Yes, not overexposing a gimmick can certainly help a wrestler to feel like a special attraction. And as we've seen today, special attractions can be one of the most important things to get right for any wrestling company. Whenever a wrestler begins their career, they no doubt have ambitions of going all the way to the main event scene. But unfortunately, that just can't be the reality for everyone. No, some are destined to find a place lower down on the card. Not that this has to be a bad thing though. No, some have made a career for themselves as jobbers, and it's those people we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the Brooklyn Brawler. Yes, in the annals of wrestling history, perhaps no more famous example of a legendary jobber has existed than the Brooklyn Brawler, and that's because throughout the majority of the 90s he was always there, ready and willing to eat a pinfall to a more focused upon talent. Seriously, if you go back to the New Generation era and look at some of those early episodes of Raw, you're almost always going to find Steve Lombardi showing up somewhere, and when he was showing up, the chances were he wasn't winning. Of course, this isn't to suggest he didn't have some level of popularity with fans at the time. No, even if he were the jobber to end all jobbers in WWF, there was a certain ownership of him that the live crowds there felt for the Brawler. And that's why, at one point during the early 90s, he even underwent a brief win streak of sorts as, for the first and only time, WWF decided to actually push him for a little bit. As you can probably guess though, this push was short-lived. And so it wasn't long before he was back to jobbing again, but still, this wasn't enough to make fans turn their backs on Lombardi. Rather, they embraced him all the more for his failure to rise up the ranks. Hell, so beloved would he be during this time, there were periods that when the Brooklyn Brawler was inactive, Steve would remain in WWF under different guises like those of Kim Chi, Abe Knuckleball Schwartz, and even Doink the Clown at one point. In the end though, it always came back to that most popular character for him, as that's the one he's best associated with. Would he ever get his due and win a title in the WWF? No, like any good jobber, he'd remain below that level for the entirety of his run there. But even if this was the case, his consistency was able to keep him in a job long after he retired, with him currently serving as a backstage producer. And that's meant that as things stand today, he will occasionally make an on-screen cameo in a backstage segment or something similar, a fitting way to remember someone who was always so low down on the pecking order. But the Brooklyn Brawler isn't the only legendary jobber who came out of the New Generation era of WWF. No, our next subject was perhaps the only man who could challenge him for the title of top enhancement talent of the time, the one, the only, Barry Horowitz. That's right, after having brief runs in a number of different territories throughout the 80s, including a short spell in WWF, the St. Petersburg native would return to Vince McMahon's employ to play the role of Jobber to the Stars. And that wasn't a bad thing necessarily. No, the wrestling world needs people to play this role. So there was no shame in Barry stepping into the ring with the likes of Tito Santana, Kerry Von Erich, Owen Hart, and Bret Hart, and staring up at the lights for them by the time all was said and done. What no one could have foreseen, however, was that as time went on, Horowitz would start to gain such a level of cult popularity with fans, there would be a demand to see him go beyond the enhancement talent role and become a featured performer. So it was then that WWF would listen to the fans, and Barry got to briefly escape the lower card. And he certainly made the most of his opportunity. What happened here exactly? Well, after beating Skip on the July 9th episode of Wrestling Challenge that year, the boy from Florida started going on something of a win streak. And this eventually led to him getting a match at that year's SummerSlam, a career highlight for him at the time. But that wasn't all. No, after winning his big pay-per-view bout, the jobber would then go on to have a somewhat successful tag team run with Hakushi as his mini-push carried on into 1996. As you can probably guess though, this mini-push would not last forever. No, by the time 96 was in full swing, Barry Horowitz would begin being pushed back down the card again as the novelty of seeing him win wore off. But even if this was how things ended, at least he can always say that for a brief moment at least, he was able to escape the life of being an enhancement talent and instead rise up to greater things, an incredibly rare feat for someone in his position. Sure, he was never able to win a title or anything. No, if we want to find an example of a jobber doing that, then we really have to move over to our next subject, a man whose main run came during the 2010s. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Heath Slater. That's right, during the PG era of WWE, you'd be hard-pressed to find a jobber who was more beloved than Heath Slater. And that's because no matter what he was being given to work with, he always managed to make it entertaining. It doesn't matter if we're talking about his runs as part of the Nexus, the Social Outcasts, Slater Gator, or perhaps most memorably 3MB, he was always able to deliver something fans could enjoy watching. Hell, his 3MB run has become legendary in hindsight when we talk about him being a perennial jobber for a more modern era, if for no other reason than because the other two members of the trio, Drew McIntyre and Jinder Mahal, would later go on to become WWE champion. Obviously though, with Heath, this never happened. No, he'd always remained stuck in the lower parts of the card as his teammates rose to bigger and better things. Well, we say that, but there was one time the West Virginian got his flowers. And that happened in 2016 when, after going undrafted during the newest incarnation of the brand split, he found himself having to beg both Raw and SmackDown for a job. But with neither side wanting him, he had to get creative, and this led to him finding a tag team partner in Rhino and making it his aim to win the SmackDown tag team titles as a free agent. Something he believed would force then Blue Brand general manager Daniel Bryan to offer him a contract. How would this work out for Slater? Pretty well as it happened because, in a true feel-good moment, it would be at the Backlash pay-per-view that he and his tag partner were able to defeat the Usos in order to hold the straps above their heads. And yes, as a result of this, the fan favorite would finally be offered a contract and a way of feeding his kids back at home. Sure, he would pretty quickly begin falling down the card again after this. We were still talking about a jobber here after all, but for that brief moment Heath Slater was able to stand on top of the world, and this is something he'll always be able to hang his hat on. Of course, he could always go one step further because, as the only member of 3MB to never be a world champion in WWE, there's still a story to be told there with him, even if it is highly unlikely this story will ever be told now. Hell, even if he doesn't win a main roster top prize, he could always get a fluke win of the NXT title. It wouldn't be like he'd be the first jobber to rise all the way to the top and hold the #1 prize in a promotion, because years prior to that, during mid-90s ECW, this very same thing was happening with our next subject, Mikey Whipwreck. That's right, if there were ever an ultimate jobber to be found in Paul Heyman's Extreme Championship Wrestling, then this would be him, because the story of Mikey Whipwreck truly is that of one of the most unlikely of heroes finding success. And when we're talking about the land of misfit toys that was Philadelphia back then, being an unlikely hero amongst the group of them is certainly saying something. But then when we're talking about someone as small as Mikey was, this is somewhat more understandable. After all, we were long before the era of people like Rey Mysterio or Daniel Bryan going all the way to the world title scene back in 1995. So that's what made it all the more shocking when, after spending years being the guy who usually got beaten up before the night was over against opponents like Taz, Marty Jannetty, and Kevin Sullivan while he was working in the 2300 arena, something special began happening. And that special thing was fans getting behind the Buffalo native to a point that Paul Heyman thought it would be a good idea to put him in a world title match. Sure, he wouldn't win his first attempt at the gold, then being held by the Sandman, but then his second attempt came. And against all odds, this time Mikey Whipwreck would beat the champion to become ECW's new top dog. And this shook the ECW main event scene up, as for the next couple of months, Whipwreck found himself feuding with a pre-Stone Cold version of Steve Austin over the right to be called champ. And what made this feud all the better was that Austin wouldn't even be the one to win it in the end, as you'd assume. No, during their big singles match, Mikey would beat him. Sure, he would drop the belt back to the Sandman not long after that, and would from there return to more of a jobber role, but no matter how hard he might have fallen again in the years following, he was always able to rest easy knowing that, for a period of time there, he has been the world champion. And that's something very few wrestlers, jobber or otherwise, will ever actually be able to say about themselves. But let's move away from ECW for a moment and back over to WWF, as it's there we find our next subject, another notable jobber who came along a couple of years later during the heights of the Attitude Era. Who are we talking about here? Why, Gillberg, of course. Yes, it was at Survivor Series 1998 that a special mystery opponent was going to be announced for Mankind. At this time, though, as Mankind was a member of the corporation and so was going to get an easy route to the finals, his opponent was going to be the biggest jobber Vince McMahon could find. Who would the boss be able to find for such a role? Well, that would be none other than Dwayne Gill, or Gillberg as he would from then on be known. Yes, with Dwayne being a bald guy with a goatee, this one was a pretty blatant parody of Bill Goldberg over in WCW, with the idea here being that rather than being a world beater, Gillberg was the most inept wrestler on the planet, someone so bad that he'd even get scared of his own pyro whenever it went off as he was approaching the ring. Needless to say then, Dwayne Gill lost to Mankind that night, but this wouldn't be the end of his run in WWF. No, over the next year or two, he'd remain a constant presence in the company's undercard as one of the perennial jobbers they had under their employ. And this was never more evident than in his time as being part of the ultimate jobber stable, the Job Squad. That said, unlike other members of the Job Squad, for a brief window of time at least, Dwayne Gill would be able to overcome the limitations of being a glorified enhancement talent, as it was in November of 1998 that he became WWF Light Heavyweight Champion after beating Christian for the honor, with him subsequently going on to hold that belt for a total of 448 days. And in the era of stars like Steve Austin, The Rock, The Undertaker, Triple H, Kurt Angle, and many, many more, any chance to get on TV when the roster was so deep was great. But as time went on and the novelty of Gillberg wore off, he'd fade away from prominence, with him eventually leaving WWF altogether in 2000. Luckily then, there were plenty of other jobbers to take his place, one of which is our next subject, Colin Delaney. Yes, it was in 2007 that Colin Delaney became the next addition to the WWE CW roster, and realizing that this was a great opportunity for his career, the Rochester native immediately set about getting to work on trying to rise up the ranks after debuting there on December 18th of that year. Pretty quickly, though, he'd find any attempts he had at becoming a star were proving to be futile, as his role would almost immediately become to do jobs to bigger names like Mark Henry, Kane, and the Great Khali. And that led to WWE, in kayfabe at least, getting cold feet about giving him a full-time contract, with the story now switching to the idea that if he wanted to earn this contract, he'd have to at least pick up a win first. Yes, it was the Heath Slater special, and just as it would later work for him, it worked for Colin Delaney too, because on the smaller stage that was WWE CW, he was able to build up something of a cult status around himself as fans there got behind his attempts to finally score a victory. Sure, it wouldn't be easy for him, but eventually, when the time came for him to step into the ring with Armando Estrada on the May 6, 2008 episode of ECW, the New Yorker would get that elusive win and, as a result, be awarded an official contract with WWE. Where would he go from here? Well, not very far. He was still a jobber after all. That's right, after having his big moment in the sun, Delaney began to settle back into the role of being a guy who looked at the lights by the time the night was over. And that would all eventually lead to a situation where, in August of 2008, he'd be released from his contract, with him from there returning to the indie circuit where he's, for the most part, remained to this day. Still, at least he got his moment. And if nothing else, that puts him among the ranks of great jobbers in wrestling, right up there with our next subject, in fact, a true legend who went by the name of Iron Mike Sharpe. That's right, like everyone else we've looked at today, where this Ontario native excelled was in serving as an enhancement talent who could put over other bigger stars. Obviously then this served him well in WWF, as across two runs, first between 1983 and 1990, and then again between 1992 and 1995, he was a constant presence on Vince McMahon's television. Sure, he was never getting a push himself or anything, but he was getting a chance to work against some true talents. We're talking about names like Bob Backlund and Ivan Putski, just to name a few. Hell, at one point in 1984, he'd even get to team up with Hulk Hogan for a while, though this team-up would happen while the pair were touring over in Japan. Yes, it wasn't exactly the career breakthrough moment it could have been for the Canadian under other circumstances, but nevertheless, it was still teaming up with the biggest star of the era. And how many jobbers can say they've been able to do something like that? Almost none, that's how many. And that's why it was such a big deal for him at the time then. Alas, though, this would be the only real true height Mike Sharp reached during his career, as the rest of it would see him firmly be in that undercard role, his job almost always to put someone else over. And that would continue even after he left the WWF in 1995 and spent the last few years of his career working on the indie circuit, taking on the likes of Virgil, King Kong Bundy, and Bam Bam Bigelow. Once this was over, however, things would change somewhat for Sharp, as following his retirement, he'd opened his own wrestling school. That's right, for a significant period of time following his retirement, Mike Sharp's school of pro wrestling would allow the Canadian to pass on everything he'd learned to the next generation. And this led to him training such people as Crowbar and the Harris Brothers. No, none of these performers would go on to main event to WrestleMania or anything, but then maybe that's fitting in a way, as the person who was showing them the ropes was one of the premier jobbers of the 80s and 90s wrestling. Was he as good of a jobber as our next subject, though? Well, that's a question which is certainly up for debate, as our next subject, a man who peaked around the same time as Iron Mike Sharp, is none other than S.D. Jones. And unlike the Brooklyn Brawler or Barry Horowitz, Jones never had that big defining moment in the public eye. But then part of the reason for this is because much of his time spent as a wrestler was before the first big boom period. Yes, while he was still around during the 80s, it was in the 70s that the Antigua native first got his start in the industry. And these early years saw him work in places like Jim Crockett Promotions and the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Over time, however, it would mainly be the WWF he'd work for, and it was while there that he was truly established as a jobber. Why was this? Well, prior to that, Jones had found some modicum of success on the territory circuit as an NWA America's Tag Team Champion. Once he ventured over to WWF on a more full-time basis, however, he never again reached these heights. Rather, his role would be to work with names like Nikolai Volkov and Greg the Hammer Valentine, and in the process, lose to them. Sure, there were brief moments of S.D. Jones getting something semi-noteworthy to do here, such as the time he formed a brief tag team with Tony Atlas, or the time he at one point even partnered with Andre the Giant for a one-off appearance, but that was never enough for him to truly rise above the level of enhancement talent. One thing it was enough for, though, was to see him get not only one, but two action figures. Yes, back during the era of LJN figures, Special Delivery Jones would get multiple made in his image, with this making him one of the very rare jobbers who have ever received such an honor. That's right, while his name is not as well remembered as some of the other enhancement talents, S.D. Jones's resume quietly makes him one of the greatest jobbers to ever do it. Hell, in 2017 his efforts would even be recognized to the point that he'd be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, albeit as part of their Legacy Acts wing. But what about our next subject? That being James Ellsworth. Yes, it was on the July 25th, 2016 episode of Raw that Ellsworth would make his debut by challenging Braun Strowman. Sure, he might have believed he had a fighting chance against the monster among men, as any man with two hands would, but he just looked like such an underdog standing there in the middle of the ring waiting to be destroyed. It was impossible not to be endeared by his character. And that was exactly why, as the months went on then, WWE would continue to bring Ellsworth back for cameo appearances at things like the Royal Rumble, with this all leading to him eventually being plugged into the WWE title feud between Dean Ambrose and AJ Styles over on SmackDown in the autumn of that year. And when we say James was plugged in here, we don't just mean he was there to do more jobs. No, in a strange turn of events, he'd at one point actually score a victory over the WWE champion, Styles. Yes, for a little while at least, James Ellsworth was the lineal WWE champion, and if that's not an achievement he can hang his hat on as a jobber, we don't know what is. Obviously, though, his time in the main event scene was not destined to last. No, the novelty was always going to wear off for this, and that was why, once the whole thing ran its course, the Baltimore native would be moved back to something more fitting when he became the valet to Carmella during the period she was attempting to become SmackDown Women's Champion. How would this work out for Ellsworth? Quite well, as it happened, as he would remain in the WWE for a while longer, and it would technically lead to him becoming the first ever Miss Money in the Bank in 2017. On top of that, it would also lead to him getting to have some bouts against Asuka and Becky Lynch. In 2018, though, Ellsworth's time with WWE would come to an end when he was released from the company. So because of that then, when you remember the Chinless Wonder's time on WWE TV, you're going to remember the brief period where he was the biggest cult sensation the WWE had on their roster, someone who should never have been a star, but somehow managed to become one for a while, all while also maintaining his jobber status at the same time. But for as great of a jobber as he was at this point, there was arguably another who was even better, and that person person would be our next subject as it happens. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Curt Hawkins. Come on now, how could we not talk about Curt Hawkins when we talk about great wrestling jobbers? After all, this is the man who quite literally was trained by a great jobber in Mikey Whipwreck, so it was almost like he took all the former ECW World Champion's power and added it to his own in order to create some kind of super enhancement talent. How would this go for his career? Exactly as you'd expect, because while the Glen Cove native was never a focused upon act, his time in the WWE as a lower card guy is legendary. Why was this? Well, because whether it be his time as a member of La Familia during the mid-2000s or his later team-ups with people like Vance Archer and Tyler Rex, he was a consistent presence in WWE for years as a guy who could always be brought in to make his opponent look great. And that not only gave him a quiet value with management, but also made him a bit of a cult sensation with fans after a while. So popular would it make him with WWE fans, in fact, when he left the company in 2014 and instead moved over to TNA, where he was treated like a bigger star, there was something of a push to see him return to WWE at some point down the line. And in the end, that's exactly what happened, as it was in 2016 that Hawkins made his re-debut in WWE. Not that he'd suddenly be a star now or anything, no, he was still very much a jobber, and this would soon see him going on an anti-Goldberg streak as he began losing match after match after match. Of course, every streak has to end eventually though, and this was where Curt Hawkins finally got his moment in the sun, because it was while he and his tag team partner Zack Ryder were challenging the Revival at, fittingly, the WrestleMania 35 pre-show, that he'd not only score a pinfall at last, but in the process he'd become a Raw Tag Team Champion. As you can probably guess, however, this was only a short run with the gold, and it wouldn't be long before Curt was back to his losing ways again. That said, it was still a great WrestleMania moment for the New Yorker, and since his most recent run with WWE ended, he's been able to segue this into singles gold success in TNA, the very place he's become a former Impact Digital Media champion. So it just goes to show that being a jobber does have its perks, and it can mean good things for someone's career. We guess it's like all things, it's just about how well you make the most out of what you're given. Being a tag team wrestler is an art form in itself, completely separate from that of working in the singles division. And it's not something everyone can pull off either. In fact, some of the greatest of all time have failed when trying to have a tag team run. Of course, the same also works if you go in the other direction too then, as at times, someone who's worked great as part of a duo will find themselves struggling when asked to go solo. But what are the notable examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into One is the Loneliest Number, Tag Team Wrestlers' Failed Singles Runs. And if we're going to start anywhere, we really have to start with the man who became the poster boy for failed singles runs. After all, the phrase Jannetty of a team has become a thing for a reason, and that's because of Marty Jannetty. What many might not remember, however, is that back during the very early days of the Rockers' run in the mid-80s, when Marty and Shawn Michaels were working across the territory circuit, it was arguably the former who was the better in-ring wrestler. Hell, even when they first went to WWF in 1988, you could make a solid case for Jannetty actually being the better of the two. As the years went on, however, it quickly became apparent that HBK was exceeding his partner in every way, and so when it came time to split the duo up in 1992, it was him who was pegged for big singles success. Not that there weren't any plans made for the Georgia native too, though. No, quite the opposite in fact, because during the subsequent feud between the now former team, Marty was presented as the babyface. Unfortunately for him, though, his notorious Slurms McKenzie level of partying outside the ring would lead to him causing so many problems he'd be fired before this program could ever reach its conclusion. And this would be a recurring problem every time he was brought back after that, as, no matter how many chances he got, Party Marty just couldn't help himself when it came to being his own worst enemy. Of course, while this was all happening, Shawn Michaels was going on to be arguably the greatest of all time. And this only served to shine an even brighter light on the failure that was Marty's single run. So much so, in fact, that, as we all know now, Jannetty has become a catch-all term for anyone who ends up being the weaker member of the duo. That said, it's still a tragedy that, at the heart of it, Marty was a very good wrestler. Maybe not as good as Shawn Michaels, but still entirely capable of being a big deal in his own right. But not every tag wrestler who fails when they go solo can be considered a punchline. No, most still have the legacy of their prior run to fall back on. So it's just as well the Road Warriors run was as legendary as it was, because when Animal started going it alone in the early 2000s, things did not go well. That said, it wasn't like he had much choice at this point, because his partner Hawk had fallen so deep into drug addiction by then, he was clearly in no position to be anywhere near a ring. Prior to that, however, it had been a very different story as, together, the Road Warriors had been arguably the greatest tag team of all time. So good that they main evented everywhere they went. Yes, whether it be Jim Crockett Promotions, the American Wrestling Association, WWF, or even out east in Japan, no one was more over than Hawk and Animal. In fact, the term Road Warrior Pop was created specifically to describe the monstrous reactions they got every time they came out from behind the curtain. Unfortunately though, after a final run together in late 90s WWF, it would be clear that Hawk needed some time away. But not wanting to hang up his own boots at this point, Animal would go on as a solo act for a while, with him at this point signing up with World Championship Wrestling. And when that flopped, he'd spend a few years away, all before returning to WWE once more in the mid-2000s, here trying out a few new tag partners in the form of Heidenreich and Matt Hardy. But after it became obvious that neither of these could match up to the now deceased Hawk, Animal decided all he had left was to go solo once more, with him this time referring to himself as the Road Warrior. And if you haven't already guessed, this would go over about as well as a fart in church, because with him already being pretty long in the tooth by then, no one had any interest in seeing one member of the famed duo stumble along without the other in 2006. So mercifully then, this run would be cut short soon thereafter, allowing Animal to fall back on his legacy as arguably the GOAT of tag team wrestling. It's just a shame our next subject didn't have that same legacy to fall back on too then, because when the Basham brothers briefly split up in 2005, Doug Basham's run as the Bash Man would be nothing less than an out-and-out failure. How did this one come about? Well, despite being a relatively popular team on SmackDown, it was felt at a certain point that, in order to freshen things up, both Doug and Danny would have to go solo. Of course, this move had always been one in Vince McMahon's playbook, so it shouldn't really have come as a surprise to them. After all, you could count on one hand the amount of tag teams in WWE who'd never split. Unfortunately though, while they might have served well enough as a duo, it quickly became clear that separated, the Bashams just weren't going to cut it as they simply didn't have the right level of charisma, mic skills, or in-ring work to make it alone. And nowhere was this more evident than with Doug Basham's short-lived run as the Bash Man here, a character de-evolution which would see him come to the ring in a leather vest, shiny wool pants, and sunglasses. Needless to say then, this made him look like a reject from Right Said Fred, leading everyone to know this one was not going to get over. And that was why, after only a few sporadic appearances on B-Show Velocity, the Bashman gimmick would be retired and he'd instead be reunited with his old partner over in the then newly revived ECW brand. But what if a performer can't just go back to their old teammate once a singles run fails? How are they supposed to recover at this point? Well, if you want an insight into that, you only have to look at another figure from around the same time period as, after a semi-successful run working as part of a team with Trevor Murdoch in the mid-2000s, Lance Cade would start a solo run of his own in 2008. So looking for something to rescue his career at this point, Cade would form a new allegiance with a bona fide main event star as he became the personal assistant to Chris Jericho. And to make matters better, this was Jericho during one of the best runs of his career, as he was then playing the quiet suit and tie clad villain. Unfortunately for his new assistant, however, the Canadian was so good in this role, it meant Cade quickly fell into the background whenever he was on screen, as he simply couldn't match him with the same level of charisma. Not that there weren't attempts made to push the focus onto him, though. No, at one point during Y2J's now legendary feud with Shawn Michaels, his protege would even score a pinfall win over HBK during a tag team match. This would end up being one of the few highlights of the run, however, as by October of that year, Lance would be released from his contract with WWE. And while the reasons for this are still unclear, former head of talent relations Jim Ross has since gone on record as saying that Cade made a major mistake while utilizing bad judgment, leaving fans to wonder what exactly he means by this. Had he stuck around for a while longer, could this singles run have caught fire? Maybe, but we'll never know that now. What we can say for sure though is that no matter how long Charlie Haas stayed on SmackDown in 2008, he was never going to get his impressionist gimmick over. But let's rewind for a little while here, because in the years prior to this, Haas had made quite a name for himself as a tag team specialist, working alongside Shelton Benjamin as part of the world's greatest tag team. And sure, while there had been periods where the two had gone their own ways and tried out solo runs, in the end, they'd always come back together, as that was how they worked best. This would all change by 2008 though, as at that point, the run of the world's greatest tag team in WWE would be over permanently. And so, realizing he needed to find something that would get him over as a singles wrestler on a more long-term basis then, Haas would start impersonating other performers whenever he came down to the ring in August of that year. Of course, we shouldn't have to tell you why this one failed. After all, it's clear for everyone to see. In pretty much every prior circumstance, an impressionist gimmick has meant instant death for the person involved, and this time was no different, no matter how many parody costumes Haas got a hold of. Yes, it didn't matter if he was pretending to be Hulk Hogan, John Cena, Stone Cold Steve Austin, or even Beth Phoenix. No one cared about seeing the once former tag team great desperately trying to keep his head above water in the singles division in this way. And that was why, by the time 2009 came around, he'd have abandoned the whole thing and returned to just being himself. It's just a shame Chris Harris couldn't do the same for his own failed singles run in WWE then, because when he joined in 2008 and introduced the world to Braden Walker, it would pretty much kill his career stone dead. Prior to that, though, he'd been a very successful tag team wrestler over in TNA where, alongside James Storm and Gail Kim, he'd formed America's Most Wanted, one of the most over pairings the company had at that time. Hell, so successful were they'd even managed to win the NWA World Tag Team titles on 5 separate occasions, all while regularly putting on some of the best bouts seen down in Nashville. And even after that was done, Harris had managed to have a brief successful solo run there too, where he got to mix it up with the likes of Kurt Angle, Christian Cage, and Dustin Rhodes. So when he signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2008 then, big things were expected of him as his reputation already preceded him. Of course, those expectations would quickly have to be reassessed after he made his debut on the July 8th episode of ECW, because there, he instantly nuked his career with one line, "Knock knock, it's Braden Walker, and I'm gonna knock your brains out." Yes, in the space of 12 simple words directed at his opponent for the night, Armando Estrada, the era of Walker was over, as after a line this bad, nothing was ever going to get fans to take him seriously again. So that was why, just 1 month later, the former NWA Tag Team Champion would be unceremoniously released from his contract, as he instead spent the next few years on the indie circuit trying to rebuild both himself and any of the momentum he once had. And spending some time elsewhere trying to rebuild themselves is something our next entry can also understand, because while she has been able to recover by working for the likes of Impact, it looked grim for a while when Peyton Royce went solo back in 2020 WWE. But perhaps that was only to be expected because, up until that point, the Australian-born star had pretty much been attached at the hip to her tag partner and real-life best friend, Billie Kay. In fact, so closely intertwined were the two, it was impossible to think of one without the other, as they would always work together during matches and would often even finish each other's sentences in promos. Yes, whether it be their successful run in NXT between 2016 and 2018, or their main roster call-up from the latter year onwards, it was just accepted that if you got one of the Iconics, you got the other too as part of the package. That was until the summer of 2020, at which point Vince McMahon made the decision to split the two up, as in his eyes, he saw Peyton as being the breakout star of the group. So after losing a match to the Riot Squad at August 30th's Payback then, both women would be forced to split and go their separate ways. Unfortunately though, with this being right in the middle of the global shutdown, there were no fans in attendance, and so it became very hard for a new singles act to get over, as there was no real way to gauge what was working and what wasn't. And maybe that's why, as the weeks went on, it became clear that Peyton Royce as a solo star wasn't really working out, mainly because she was missing such a key part of what made her special. But while the two would ultimately be reunited, it would end up being outside of WWE, as after the Boss cut both the Iconics as part of a mass wave of releases that year, they'd eventually reform over in Impact Wrestling as the Inspiration. And since then, it looks like both Peyton and Billie have decided to take some time away from the ring, with the reason Royce in particular chose to do so being because she's about to give birth to her first child with AEW star Shawn Spears. So let this be an example that there can sometimes be silver linings to failed solo runs. Of course, it helps if you're able to reunite with your tag partner again after the fact, something which was also the case for Sylvain Grenier after his own failed singles career in 2005. How did this one come about? Well, despite spending the prior 3 years working alongside fellow French-Canadian stars Rene Dupree and Rob Conway as part of La Resistance, it was felt by then the time had come to split the three off and give each a chance to go it on their own. And in the case of Grenier, this meant being drafted over to SmackDown, where he would now be fully separated from his teammates, no longer having them to rely on anymore should times get tough. So realizing he would need to reinvent himself at this point, the former tag team champion would decide to do so by repackaging himself as simply Sylvain, a narcissistic male supermodel who knew he looked better than everyone else and wasn't afraid to make this clear. How he chose to make this clear left a lot to be desired, however, as instead of coming to the ring proudly waving the French flag as he had done before, Sylvain would instead walk down the aisle every week to pretty bad techno music, all while wearing sunglasses and speaking in a light European accent, which made him feel more like Alex Wright than anything else. But even if the entrance was bad, at least he still had the in-ring portion of his act to fall back on, right? Well, not really as it happened, because never really excelling above the level of competent wrestler, the heel would struggle to wow fans with his subsequent performances against the likes of Hardcore Holly. That was why, come 2006, he decided to mix things up all over again, with him this time reintroducing himself to audiences in pre-taped vignettes, revealing himself to be the new ambassador of Quebec. And his reason for this change in role? Well, he wanted to bring peace between French Canada and the USA, a facade which quickly fell away as this soon became yet another story of evil foreigners encroaching on America. But while this might have worked better in another era, by 2006 it was pretty out of touch with the times. So needless to say then, this gimmick would also not be long for the world as, following a lengthy losing streak, Sylvain would have given up on singles action when he returned to Ohio Valley Wrestling so as to re-team with his old partner, Rob Conway. That said, what if you can't go back to your old partner? What do you do then? Well, this is exactly the situation our final subject today found himself in at the end of the 2000s, as after previously playing the role of Jesse, tag team partner and handler of Festus, Ray Gordy would be repackaged as Slam Master Jay. Yes, there's a pretty good chance you've forgotten this one existed entirely because, really, it didn't last all that long. Of course, that's not much of a surprise, as the gimmick of wannabe white boy thug was already dead on arrival in 2009, so much so that after only a few weeks of debuting it, Gordy was barely getting any TV time at all. And when he was, it wasn't much to write home about because when it became clear that he wasn't going to cut it as a solo star, Slam Master Jay would be placed into a go-nowhere tag team act alongside Jimmy Wang Yang. Of course, once they failed to make a splash then, there was little hope left for the son of the legendary Terry Gordy, as by April of 2010, he'd be released from his contract altogether. Luckily for him though, he was able to bounce back after this, as from there, he'd choose to retire from the ring and instead become a police officer. And this just goes to show that there are always other options out there for people should their solo careers not work, even if they're out of the industry entirely. That said, most won't have to go to these lengths so as to recover. No, as we've seen today, the majority of people who fail to work out as single stars can always return to the division which made them successful in the first place. After all, as we said at the start of this video, being a tag team wrestler is an art form in itself, and if it's what you're good at, there's no reason to ever stop doing it because there will always be a need for great duos in wrestling. WWE is without a doubt the most successful wrestling promotion of all time. However, there are still plenty of other great companies out there filled with plenty of great wrestlers. And some of those wrestlers have managed to build very successful careers without ever stepping foot inside a WWE ring. But who are the most notable examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Will Ospreay. Yes, there is a solid argument to be made that Will Ospreay is the best in-ring performer in the world today, and that's impressive when you consider he's never once set foot inside of a WWE ring. What has the aerial assassin been doing instead of this then? Well, applying his craft at an incredibly high level just about everywhere else of note. And it all started back in the early 2010s when he was working the UK indie circuit in places like Progress and Revolution Pro. Of course, all his work there would eventually lead to him getting a shot in New Japan in 2016. And it was here that Ospreay finally broke out on a larger scale, as this was right in the middle of that company's great run. Obviously then, the competition was high, but Will was able to stand toe-to-toe with anyone he was put up against, with this leading to him becoming a world champion in the promotion. The only question left after that then was, where else could he go from there? And the answer to that would be AEW, because it would be in March of 2024 that Ospreay had his first match inside of an all-elite ring as a full-time member of the roster. And since then, he's not only become a two-time international champion, but he's also furthered his case for being one of the greats by having fantastic matches against names such as Konosuke Takeshita, Swerve Strickland, MJF, and Bryan Danielson. All of this is to say that of all the wrestlers who have never appeared in WWE, Will Ospreay might just be at the top of the list, as in his own words, he really is on another level. But is he as good as our next subject, a current tag team partner of his who goes by the name of Kenny Omega? That's right, before Ospreay was the top gaijin in New Japan, that moniker went to the cleaner instead, as it was during the mid-2010s that he rose to the top of the card there with a quartet of matches against someone we'll get to in a moment, which were some of the best of all time. One place he never appeared to give any real consideration towards going to, though, was WWE, and the reason for this appears to be that he had a bad experience with trainer Bill DeMott back when he served a brief spell in Deep South Wrestling, one of WWE's developmental territories, during the mid-2000s. That said, this isn't to say Kenny wouldn't make a splash in America eventually. Yes, it was in 2019 that alongside the Young Bucks and Cody Rhodes, he became a founding father of All Elite Wrestling, and this would allow him to be shown to a whole new TV audience as, over the course of the next few years, he'd go on to become the AEW World Champion. Is there a chance he could still go to WWE at some point before his career ends? It certainly is possible, but it's unlikely now, as with him in his early 40s and winding down, the time for him to jump would have almost been in 2023 when his AEW contract came up. Yes, wrestling is better on all sides when competition exists. And this competition can also lead to things like bidding battles for the performers, something which we saw in 2024 when our next subject was deciding what to do with his career next. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Kazuchika Okada. Yes, this is a man that many fans consider to be the best in-ring performer in the world, and the reason for that is because he is that good. Really, very few have ever approached the levels he has, and that's exactly why in his native Japan he'd become the face of the promotion, with him becoming a multiple-time world champion. Yes, at a certain point it became hard for Okada to find anything new to achieve that he hadn't already done in Japan, and that was why in 2024 he decided it was time for him to try his hand out in the West and see if he could conquer that world too. But while many hoped it would be WWE he would go to here, a move that would have allowed him to set foot inside that ring for the first time ever and mix it up with new names such as Seth Rollins, CM Punk, and Roman Reigns, in the end he chose to sign with AEW and become the newest member of the Elite. How has the Rainmaker fared since his AEW debut there? Well, he's been able to create a brand new character, and has continued to prove he can still deliver just as well as ever when the bell rings. And it looks like this is the way things are going to continue for him as time goes on then, with him happy to earn the big bucks in America and work a relatively light schedule. But he's not the only great Japanese legend who's never gone to the WWE, as the same thing could be said about our next subject too, the Great Muta. Yes, back in the 90s, the Great Muta was one of the biggest stars in Japan. That said, the thing many Western fans will know him best for today would be his time in WCW. How did he manage to appear in WCW? Well, that was because back in the 90s, while he was still a part of the NJPW roster, those two companies had a working relationship with one another. And this allowed Muta to appear on a number of World Championship Wrestling shows and even join the NWO at one point, exposing himself to a much wider audience in the process. Hell, it was during this run that he not only became a one-time NWA World Television Champion, but also a one-time NWA World Tag Team Champion, alongside someone else we'll get to in a moment. Did he ever give any real consideration to going to WWE at some point, even for a one-shot like Jushin Thunder Liger famously did on NXT that one time? It doesn't appear so, as he's always seemed happy to have his base be in Japan, with any itch he had to work stateside being served by WCW. And because of that, then, he'll always go down as one of the biggest legends who never made it into a WWE ring, even if his Great Muta gimmick would have made him a perfect fit for such a thing. Sure, he would go into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2023, but that was more a show of respect than anything else, and not any indication he seemed like he was going to be jumping ship. But what of that tag team partner of his we alluded to a moment ago? He never ended up in WWE either. Though, in his part, WCW aside, his name wouldn't be made in Japan, rather, it would be made in Mexico. Who are we talking about here? Why, Vampiro, of course. Now, here's a name many fans will likely remember from the days of the Monday Night Wars, as when both WWF and WCW were on fire, Vampiro was able to make a big-time name for himself stateside as a key member of the latter promotion's mid-card. No, he was never in the world title scene or anything, but he didn't need to be, as what he was doing where he was got him so over, he was a superstar anyway. It didn't matter if we were talking about his feuds with people like Sting and Mike Awesome or his wacky promos, the Ontario native always delivered. Sadly though, this would not be enough to see him get picked up by Vince McMahon when WWE bought WCW out in 2001. No, with the doors of WWE being closed to him at this point for one reason or another, Vampiro would return to the place he'd first become a superstar, and that was Mexico. Obviously then, this led to Ian Hodgkinson, the man behind the gimmick, finding a lot of success there, specifically in CMLL where he'd become a one-time World Light Heavyweight Champion. But it wasn't just CMLL that Vampiro made a splash in before and after his run in WCW, as he would also make appearances for the other big league of Mexico, AAA, as well as All Japan and TNA too. Still though, for most fans, his prime run would have been in WCW, as that's when he was the most visible. And it's this run which has allowed him to remain a prominent figure right up until the present day, as in recent years, he's continued to show up for smaller promotions like the NWA and the Insane Clown Posse's Juggalo Championship Wrestling. Could his career have been ever bigger if he'd gotten that run in WWE before all was said and done? Maybe, it's hard to say. It certainly would have introduced him to an all-new audience again. But then it's hard to imagine even Vince McMahon making Vampiro as big of a deal as he was in Mexico during the 90s. No, maybe it was for the best that he never went to the WWF and instead was able to blaze his own trail, one which allowed him to be one of those few who turned themselves into a bona fide legend without ever heading over to the WWF. It's not something that many people can say, even big names of Lucha Libre like Conan, Rey Mysterio, and Mil Mascaras. That said, it is something which can be said by at least one other lucha legend, our next subject as it happens, the one, the only, La Parka. Yes, if you were to list the greatest luchadors of the 90s and 2000s, then he'd be very high up on that list, arguably right at the top alongside the aforementioned Rey Mysterio. Unlike Ray, however, La Parka was able to reach such heights without ever once going over to WWE. Now, he did it all either in Mexico or for a brief time over in World Championship Wrestling. Yes, like with Vampiro, it's probably La Parka's WCW run which most fans today will be familiar with, as it was the one which saw him put on some of the most innovative wrestling ever seen for the time period. Of course, for fans who'd been watching him in AAA prior to that though, this would be nothing new to them as they'd be all too aware of just how great the Hermosillo native was. And that's exactly why, during his time spent in that promotion, he'd win a litany of belts, including the GPCW Super X Monster Championship, the Mexican National Atomicos Championship, the Mexican National Cruiserweight Championship, and the Mexican National Tag Team Championships. Sure, there's an argument to be had that for as great as his career was, it could have been even better if he had that run in WWE. After all, the WWE is always on the lookout for a new Latino star to push to the top of the card, and La Parka would have been as good of a fit for that role as anybody. But then this could have been a risk, as rather than ending up as the next Rey Mysterio, there would have always been the chance La Parka became the next Sin Cara instead. Yes, like with some of the other people we've discussed today, maybe it's for the best that La Parka never went to WWF, as it meant he could do things his own way, and that puts him in the rarefied air of everyone we've looked at today so far. But what about a great tag team that never made it to WWE? Well, for that, we need to look to our next subjects, the Briscoe brothers. That's right, they might never have gotten a run in WWE like so many other great teams of their era did, but that shouldn't suggest they weren't great. No, during their run together in Ring of Honor between 2005 and 2023, the duo made up of Mark and Jay were just about as unbeatable as any duo could be. And that was why, over the course of that period of time, they'd become tag team champions on a total of 13 separate occasions. But it wasn't just ROH that the Briscoe brothers found success in, of course, because they'd also be at the top of the mountain in other places like TNA, Game Changer Wrestling, Combat Zone Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and New Japan too, with them adding another 7 sets of tag team titles to their tally across these promotions. And then there were the solo runs each of the brothers went on while they were taking short breaks from being a single unit, short breaks which back during the 2010s led to Jay Briscoe becoming a 2-time Ring of Honor World Champion. Sadly though, any hopes fans might have had of seeing them reach the big leagues was squashed when, in early 2023, mere weeks after they finished their classic trilogy of bouts with FTR, Jay would tragically pass away, and this would mean his brother Mark would now be forced to go it solo. Luckily for him, however, by that point ROH was owned by All Elite Wrestling, and this meant the last surviving Briscoe was now able to not only appear there, but also on AEW television on a regular basis, with him becoming a very popular mid-card act in the years since. Hell, at one point in April of 2024, he'd even honor his brother by winning the belt he'd once held, the Ring of Honor World title, after beating Eddie Kingston at Supercard of Honor on WrestleMania weekend. And that makes this team one who has the rare distinction of not only being both tag champs, but both being world champs in the singles division too. But what about a member of a famous wrestling family that never made it to WWE? Well, for that, we must look at Teddy Hart. Now, on the face of things, Teddy Hart should have been a shoo-in for success in WWE, if for no other reason than because of his last name. Yes, as a member of the famous Hart family, the same one that gave us Bret, Owen, and the British Bulldog, just to name a few, it must have felt like an obvious decision for Vince McMahon to bring this Calgary native into the fold at some point when he first started getting going during the mid-90s. And that's exactly what happened then when, in 1998, after seeing some of his work on the indies, the boss signed Teddy up to a developmental contract. The only problem with this, though, was that he'd never make a single appearance in a WWE ring following that. Why was this? Well, Teddy Hart has been described as a headache behind the scenes, with him getting into a lot of trouble backstage. And so it was then that after spending 4 years in developmental, learning at Terry and Dory Funk's Funkin' Conservatory in Florida, the youngster would be cut from his contract and sent off to wrestle elsewhere. That's right, despite being an incredibly talented wrestler already by now, Teddy would never make it to the big time and instead begin working in places like Ring of Honor, TNA, and Major League Wrestling. Hell, even when the WWE tried to give him a second chance during the mid-2000s by briefly bringing him into their developmental systems at the time, Ohio Valley Wrestling and Florida Championship Wrestling, he'd managed to get into more trouble behind the scenes, to the point that a main roster call-up simply became impossible. So where is he today? Well, as things stand in 2025, Teddy Hart appears to be retired, or at least semi-retired. And that's because the last we saw of him in a ring was when he was wrestling for MLW back in 2019. Does this mean he's done for good? Quite possibly. That said, his reputation for being a wild child might be nothing compared to our next subject, New Jack. What earned him such a reputation? Well, during his time working in places like the USWA, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and most famously Extreme Championship Wrestling back in the 90s, the Greensboro native would cause chaos both on and off screen everywhere he went. So wild would he be at times, in fact, even Paul Heyman would have to be wary of when and where he booked him, as there was a good chance he was going to do something that was going to get the cops called. Just look at the infamous mass transit incident, a moment which took place at an ECW show in November of 1996, and which involved New Jack taking on an untrained rookie and beating him up so bad that he legitimately ended up in the hospital. Really, if you were getting in the ring with New Jack, you were going to have to accept that you might not get out again. So obviously, given how much of a risk he was, Vince McMahon never showed any interest in bringing New Jack in as a full-time performer. No, even when he bought out ECW in 2001 and brought in people like Rob Van Dam and Tommy Dreamer, their former co-worker would remain on the sidelines. Hell, even when ECW had its invasion of Monday Night Raw back in 1997, New Jack was nowhere to be seen, as Vince knew all too well that if he decided to go off script, someone was liable to get hurt. Of course, that means we'd never get to see the madness that might have been New Jack taking on Mick Foley inside of Hell in a Cell, or the sheer brutality that would have been him getting involved in tables, ladders, and chairs with the Hardys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian. Yes, in the end, it was probably a good idea that New Jack never went to the WWF. That said, the same thing cannot be said for our next subject, someone who, in many ways, was the king who never was. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Magnum TA? Yes, it was in 1984 when the rise of Magnum TA truly began to get going, as it was when he joined Jim Crockett Promotions, and soon thereafter beat Wahoo McDaniel to win the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship. Why was Magnum such a rising star here? Well, because he was just about everything that territory was looking for in a top guy to counter Hulk Hogan, as unlike the Hulkster's theatrics, he was a tough guy brawler. Needless to say, then it was only supposed to be a matter of time until the Virginian rose all the way to the top and won the NWA World's title from Ric Flair, with him at this point leading the charge in JCP's counterattack against the WWF. Sadly though, before that could happen, a car accident he was involved in later on in October of 1986 would put a stop to this when he was left in a wheelchair as a result. Yes, now unable to wrestle anymore, what should have been the Magnum TA era came to an end before it could even get started, with this leaving us with one of the biggest what-ifs in wrestling history. Would he have been a big enough star to help Jim Crockett Promotions gain more ground over Vince McMahon and not have to be bought out by Ted Turner a couple of years later? Possibly. Magnum TA certainly appealed to a much more adult demographic after all, and with this demographic by his side, who's to say how high he could have risen? And who knows, once his time down in the Carolinas came to an end, there was always the possibility he would have had a run in the WWF as well, just as prior top JCP stars Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes later went on to do. Honestly, given how much Vince McMahon was already looking for a replacement for Hogan by the time the late 80s came around, we can't discount the idea that Magnum would have gone there and gotten a push as the next top guy of the company, with him taking the Ultimate Warrior spot at WrestleMania 6. But ultimately, we'll never know if this would have been the way things worked out because fate is a cruel mistress, and she made sure the Virginian never wrestled past 1985. No, once his car accident happened, he'd be forced to watch on from the sidelines as Sting took his spot instead. Still, it wasn't all bad for Magnum because he would recover some movement in his extremities again as the years went on. So there is something of a silver lining to his story. That said, we can't help but wonder what it might have been like had he reached the top and then gone to WWE one day. Just as we can't imagine how that might have played out for everyone else we've looked at today too, as each of them would have certainly changed the landscape of wrestling in their own unique way.